I think I'm pulling this from the Guitar Hero 3 boss battle where you fight Tom Morello. Is that where this is coming from in my head? I think that's where it's coming from. Yes? Okay, so that's where that's from. Okay. There we go. Yeah, deep lore. Whew. There we go. What's up? Got a donut to read still? Oh yeah, we have so many donuts to get through. Okay, only right after I ended stream did I check Discord and I know, Jazz Dog, and saw econoboi had messaged me being like, yeah, you did miss the time, but we can just do it now if you want. But I was already offline by then, so I felt like kind of an idiot, and I just, yeah. Is it just the debate now? I wanted to talk about one other thing. Also, we have to talk about donos, but debate first, okay? Yes, leftist scheduling. It's known. Leftist skull shape. Very sad. Excuse me. All right, we're talking about worker co-ops. Though I don't actually know econoboi's stance on worker co-op, so I don't know how I don't know how much uphill battle I'm gonna have to. Yeah, I don't know how much of an uphill battle it's gonna be. You know, I don't know if it's gonna be like I don't know if it's gonna be like, you know, we have to argue in favor of the premise that workers are capable of self-organization or whatever else. Did you get more sleep? No. If you want to fix your sleep schedule, you can't take a nap in the middle of the day. Do you honestly believe that Hassan Kopi was defending you, or is that not just to burn him as an ally? What? Do you honestly believe that Hassan Cope that he was defending you, or is that just not to just not burn him as a ally? What? When did Hassan defend me? I think that's proper English apart from the article A instead of N, but I don't. Victor Drama. Oh, is it a DGG frog? Destiny talked about you today in the Hassan debate thing. Ah, gotcha. No wonder. Whenever you see like really stupid takes on an issue, you know that Destiny's talked about it recently, and he's inspired the mob. Destiny's dream title was Vosh's future. Dude, he wants me to fucking burn and fail so bad. Holy shit. I don't think he thinks about me so fucking much. Holy shit. Um, Hassan thing is something you brought up last stream with Christian and Felix were. Oh! Oh, okay. Maybe it's either he's too stupid or other like his fans are too stupid. It's kind of impossible to tell. Hassan won't ever have me on his stream because I'm an optics landmine. Also, I'm banned from Twitch, okay? That's like probably the real reason, right? That's probably more so the real reason, more so than anything else, right? But by like bitching about like debate bro community, that's like the most, I guess, optically, or what would you call it, civil way of saying that. To put it another way, even if you guys were the most like civil, passive, non-debate broy, non like antagonistic audience in the universe, he still wouldn't have me on. How is that defending him? Why was Hassan unbanned? I haven't even submitted my ban appeal. Is it a perm ban from Twitch? It's an indefinite ban. I don't think he was implying that much by as people said. I don't know why people got so hung up about it. Hassan is like super PTSD triggered by like debate. Hold on. That clip of you saying he was defending you by shitting on you and your community was hilarious. That's all I'm saying, lol. Did he even talk about me in that clip? He just said my community. Didn't he just say I don't want to do debate stuff because the community is annoying? He just like making shit up? Listen, just because Destiny falls asleep every night thinking about me doesn't mean you have to too, okay? He's chosen his path, but you're free. You're free to live life as you want. Getting involved in petty internet drama and making up stuff about people you don't like because the people you watch don't like them That's not the life you have to live, okay? Let's call econoboi. Let me pee first, though. There's so much out there for you, okay? Yo. Let's go. Let's go. This rift slash non-rift between you and Hassan is annoying. I don't... Guys. Hassan and I are in totally different lanes. I don't... I don't know. I know you guys want like something to happen, but there's like nothing. I've like chatted with Hassan in DMs. It's like fine. We do like different things, you know? There's not like a rift or a non-rift. We're just two different... There's no other like content creator that I do like collabs with. It's not like I have a precedent of doing like collabs with everyone else but Hassan, you know? Okay. What are we talking about? Work or collab? Ideally, collabs. What brand is that water bottle? Bottle Joy. It's like a super, super good, like sturdy water bottle. Water, jug. Oh my god. Dude, you can suss out DGG fans like phrenology, man. You don't even need the calipers to measure their skull shapes. Vosh, I get that you've carved out your own niche ideology that makes good money, but don't pretend people are just following someone else because they call out your coat. Like you can tell no thought went into the message, but they were drooling, you know? They were very you know what I mean? Like it's one of those things where you read the tone more than the message. Here.
Hello.
Howdy.
How how is life going, Vosh?
Oh, pretty well. Surviving in spite of a general lack of sleep. But you know who else doesn't sleep? The
Okay.
working class. So,
Oh,
solidarity.
really? Okay. That's fair. Give me 1 second here. Just gonna throw up your I'm getting better at this whole live stream format thing. It's helped me a lot with my debate format, what with being being a logo on the internet.
Yeah, it definitely takes a little bit of time to find one's niche or to get familiar with the format at least.
This is true. This is true. Okay. I'm going to figure it out here in a second. There we go. We figured it out. Okay. Now just give me 1 second. Okay, gotta. Oh, jeez. All right. I think we have figured it out. Okay. We can do it now. Well, hello, chat. It's nice to have returned. Oh, Jesus. Give me 1 second.
No worries.
It's not a troll. I'm not trolling, I swear. I'm stumbling I don't know, when you started streaming, how long did it take you to really know how to do all this shit? Were you a huge boomer like me, or were you a natural?
I still don't. I constantly
Okay.
mess stuff up. So yeah, there's no really getting over it, I don't think.
You know, that's perfectly reasonable. I realize that people might follow my Twitch in the midst of this debate, so I've been a bit lazy about turning off my notification during these little debates.
Oh, you're not.
So I need to.
You're not streaming on Twitch, right?
No, I'm not streaming at all. But I
Okay.
have set. I record through OBS, and I've set up everything to stream. I'm just waiting on getting enough money to like get a PC, and so um, I've turned the all the notifications on and everything. So randomly throughout my discussions for the last several months, people have heard the little notification go off because I haven't turned it off on the regular stream.
Oh, that tracks. Yeah, I think. Well, if it's any consolation, your audio is already leagues better than most of the people I talk to, including people with stream setups. So I feel like you've put the
Thank
good
you.
foot forward.
Yeah, I don't know if people. I don't know. I mean, I just bought a nice mic. I haven't really done like anything particularly with my audio. And I can't hear it. Like every time I'm editing my audio, I'm like, man, this sounds like shit. But um, I've just got really a bad. I've got a bad ear for it. I remember I saw a video once of a. Um, I saw a video once of a guy. He was comparing a $15 mic to a $3,000 mic, and I couldn't hear the difference. I could. And he was like, "Oh, it's so obvious." I was like, oh, "Okay." I mean, not
Yeah,
to
a
me, I
lot of that
guess.
a lot of that shit is cope, I think. I mean, like people will spend like $60 for like a, like gold-plated audio cable that sounds exactly the same as a normal one that you could buy from Best Buy. I feel like sometimes they get like money from companies to sponsor products, and sometimes they just like the hipster cred of getting to show off how fancy. If I spent $10,000 on like a microphone setup, I probably would also be telling everyone how unbelievably amazing it is, just for my own sake.
Well, I think this guy did the smart thing. He did the video was just comparing the mic quality, so he just rented the $3,000 mic. He didn't actually buy it, which is pretty smart, I guess. But well, all right. So I guess before we start, first of all, obviously, thanks for having me on again. It was fun last time, and I got a lot of feedback from the first debate. Most of it was relatively positive, but the one consistent piece of advice was that I need to be more aggressive. So if you will, just can you give me a second? I just want to yell at you for maybe 20 seconds
Yeah,
to
go
give the
for it.
people what they want.
Hit me up.
Okay. I've been working on this. Okay. A little nervous. Okay, boss, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Okay, that was one.
Hmm.
I've got two more.
Okay.
Uh, you're so fucking stupid that if you were born in the 1930s, you would have been lobotomized by your parents. All right, that was the second one.
It's good. It's good.
Okay, and I've got the third. The third one's okay. Just don't get triggered by the third one, okay?
Okay.
The third one. You, sir, are not very good at Metroid.
We were doing some research then before the
Yeah,
conversation.
just a little bit. Just a little bit. I did. I posted to your subreddit about the debate coming up. This one today, and someone said that I can't possibly win because of my rampant idealism.
Mhm.
And so I should debate you dialectically, materially, to stand a chance. What do you think of that advice?
I think that that would be an unwinnable position from your end because the economy is not real in a dialectically materialist sense. It's an idea,
Okay.
so it's pretty much
Hmm.
just over and done with right out the gate.
Economics itself is idealism.
Hmm.
I see. Okay, that makes sense. But all right. Well, yeah. Okay. So I guess if you want to go ahead and get started, I've got questions. I've got a little frame for how this can go. If you want to start there.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, with regards to worker cooperatives, of which I seem to be one of the more vocal advocates online, I think that it would be good if we not only changed existing laws in order to either subsidize or incentivize the creation of new worker cooperatives, and there are a number of ways in which you can do this, from tax incentives to preferential loans to a tremendous number of ways you can approach that. And I think that more research should be done in that particular field, because my dream would be a worker cooperative economy, one in which private ownership of any company is illegal, at least past a certain size. If you have one or two people doing a startup, it seems a little unwieldy to have a government mandated democratic threshold that you have to meet. That seems like it'd be very difficult to legislate. But past a certain size, I think it's reasonable to aim for the goal of a completely cooperative economy. Economically, I think that it's difficult to make a full case for the effectiveness of this because we just have so little data. We know that worker cooperatives are effective in many respects at a small level, though in some fields they, in terms of economics, perform equally well to traditionally run firms. In some, they seem to exceed in some margins. Workers seem to be a bit happier. In larger firms, I mean, I'm talking like transnational corporations, I'd be interested in seeing how a worker cooperative model could be applied to that. I imagine this project, this experiment, could take a very long time, as it should, because it's important to gather good data on that sort of thing. And to finish, the truth is, though, I talk about economic productivity, but the reality of this is that I really don't give a shit whether or not worker cooperatives are more effective or efficient than traditionally run firms. In fact, they could be less effective than traditionally run firms, and I would still advocate for them for political reasons, if not economic reasons. For the same reason that even if you presented me data proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that an authoritarian government is more effective at quick decision making than a democratic government, I would still favor democracy in any situation because I think the ability to control the systems in which you live is just a fundamental right humans should have access to.
Okay. And so you've kind of answered some of the questions that I figured I would start out with. So market socialism, I guess to you, is basically a cooperative, worker cooperatives, essentially. Like, if you, well, not that that's the only way that worker, or not so, that that's the only way that market socialism could come into being, but basically your version of market socialism is, when 95% of businesses are worker cooperatives, it sounds like.
Yeah, ideally. I think that there are a number of ways to approach it, but the abolition of the bourgeois is a necessary prerequisite. That's one effective way of doing it.
Okay. And that makes some sense. And you feel like even if the data could show you that worker cooperatives are demonstrably sort of worse than traditional firms, you would still advocate for them because principally you think that basically worker democracy is kind of an a priori issue.
Yes. If they were so much worse, I mean, so categorically ineffective, that trying to implement that model would lead to like civilizational collapse or would reduce the standard of living so drastically that you would actually get more benefits from authoritarianism across the board. If democracy truly could not function, then I would be willing to consider, compromises in that respect. But thankfully, the data doesn't seem to indicate that worker cooperatives are anywhere near that ineffective. Um, or at least we'd need more data to find out if they are.
Yeah. So I think that in general, my position on this would be that I think incentives are good. I don't know of anybody who's sort of inherent. I don't know of anybody who has some sort of intrinsic opposition to worker cooperatives. To be fair, I mean, even like I don't see even why like a conservative would have a problem with people voluntarily forming a worker cooperative unless they're just kind of weird. And I think most people could also get on board with incentives. I think that, however, two things with regard to incentives and then with regard to the future economy where you're sort of mandated to be cooperatives. I think that with regard to incentives, I don't actually think they would be that effective at transforming the economy to be even close to entirely worker cooperatives. I don't think that would be enough. A mandate would get you there, but I think that a mandate has so many structural problems that I could conceive of a society where a worker cooperatively sort of mandated economy is actually a fair bit worse than our current economy. And the third thing that I would say is that what I would say from a sort of a more capitalist sort of social democratic perspective is that democracy in the workplace isn't even necessarily a bad idea. I mean, the idea of a collaborative sort of more committee oriented workplace is fine, but I think there's actually better ways to implement democratic structures in the workplace than necessarily some sort of cooperative mandate. And I think there's good ways to implement those things that are alternative to or in addition to worker cooperative incentives that I think would be advantageous and ultimately better than some sort of a more strict mandated system.
Better to what end?
Well, I mean, better to the end of economic growth is one thing, right? Better for economic growth. I think also ultimately better for the workers as well, right? I mean, obviously, I think you would agree that there's a lot of workers who maybe wouldn't necessarily want to be the owners of their business, right? There's risks associated with being a worker, sure, but there's additional sort of unique risks that are associated with being the owner of a business, and that's not to mention that forget about the sort of well, it really comes back to the investment risk is one thing, sure, but there's the sort of employment risk as an owner. That's one thing, sure, but that same risk sort of applies with a worker as well. But there's sort of credit and financial risks that don't exist for workers that exist for owners. And I think that when you make a worker necessarily be invested several $100,000s into one single business, I mean that's just that sort of flies in the face of relatively standard financial advice, right? Which is like you don't want to invest like almost all your net worth into a single business. And I think that in a worker cooperative sort of mandated economy, you're requiring workers to do that, and they simply might just not want to, right? I think that would be fine. That would be a fine choice for them to make, especially under my framework, which is more flexible, but also includes a lot of sort of protections for workers that I think are fairly robust.
I don't know what additional risk there would be. In a worker cooperative economy, if you want to join with a place and you pass some minimal probationary period and you become a member, I don't know why you would need to rely on an investment of hundreds of thousands of dollars to do so. The same amount of money is there presently, conceptually, in an economy which is democratically owned or traditionally owned. I don't know why you would need to incur any more of a risk as an owner. As a worker, we know that there are plenty of perils you face in the job market. The possibility of losing your job suddenly, which can happen essentially at any time with no severance in the States, at least in a great many fields. Fired without cause. You can travel for a job that gives way underneath your feet very quickly. I don't know what additional risk you would incur. And I don't think it's something workers should have a choice to. I don't think they should have the freedom to not be free. We don't give people, after all, the opportunity to sell their ability to vote in federal elections, right? If we did, we can imagine that would be quite destructive. I bet many people would if they could. If you could offer a person $10,000 and they could never vote again, but instead, like the person who bought the vote from them could vote in their stead. You can imagine situations where, conglomerates would buy up thousands or millions of votes to sway local and federal elections massively. I think there are significant consequences to allowing people the ability to opt out of democracy, even if it's something they don't want necessarily.
Well, I think the issue is that we can have democracy in the workplace, but I think that when you tie democracy and democratic structures to ownership, that's when you run into economic problems, right? So, you mentioned, why would you need a huge investment in the business? Well, if you're gonna own a business, right, you have to buy equity in that business, and I think that under a lot of socialist type frameworks, I think that ownership without equity seems well, it seems like an oxymoron almost, right? You do have to invest some sort of capital into the business. Otherwise, what would starting businesses look like? What would selling businesses look like? Would that even be possible? I'm not sure, honestly. But in general, though, if we assume that a market socialist society can maintain to at least some reasonable degree the wealth of today's society, then it would necessarily be the case that workers would be heavily invested in the businesses that they work in. You might say that that's a good thing. All that I would say is that's a structural barrier for a lot of people. And I think that also that's a reasonable choice that people might not want to make. It's not that people wouldn't necessarily be listened to under my system. I think worker board membership is a great policy. I think unionization is a great policy. I think a robust welfare state's a great policy. I think in a system where you have a robust welfare state, pretty ubiquitous unionization, and mandatory worker board membership, sort of that democratic, democracy in the workplace, basically. I don't really see why it's necessarily the case that we would have to make all businesses cooperatives, unless, of course, we're just sort of tied to that idea of socialism. My system might not be considered socialist, whereas yours would be, but I'm not sure that that's a system that's necessarily better for the workers.
I am tied to that idea. If we're limiting our discussion exclusively to what looks better on a GDP chart, then we would continue with neoliberalism until the planet burned. But there are broader considerations. Nobody smashed graphs together to figure out whether or not it was worthwhile to give people the vote. It's something you fight for as a matter of principle. And I do think there are direct downstream consequences of the economic authoritarianism we live under now. First of all, I just don't think there's any additional risk. Worker cooperatives already exist. You don't need to buy into them. It's a system in some countries. I think in France, for example, it's fairly normalized that there's a buy-in to a worker cooperative, but that's by no means necessary. In either case, capital acquisition is difficult for forming worker cooperatives, but that's primarily because we live in a system where the primary means of investment for larger corporations is through the stock market, which confers, of course, not just investment, but ownership and control. That's a choice we make. The stock market doesn't have to be that way. Investment in a company, worker cooperatives, can be non-controlling. Shares can just be an investment that you receive returns from if your investment is sound. A lot of the issues we have with worker cooperatives and the funding they can accrue right now is just that we've so normalized the process of selling out the democratic right of the workers at a firm that the idea of investing without getting that additional bonus is unattractive to potential investors. But that's essentially like saying, we shouldn't have like workers' rights because countries without workers' rights are more fruitful to investment because they have to pay lower wages and don't worry about OSHA. Just because we've built a system right now where you can get away with stuff that I find reprehensible. We've set the bar low, but conceptually, all of these processes of investment can take place in a system where there is not a single private capital owner, where everyone simply owns a portion of the workplace that they participate at, or at the very least democratically controls. You can work out the difference between like controlling shares versus just like internal democratic management. But either way, what I care about principally, I think, is the democratic management. If workers are still getting their wages, but they have the ability to vote internally, that would satisfy my criteria for a worker cooperative.
Okay, well, if that's the case, though, I think I think that convincingly you would just agree with my system, right? So you mentioned that no one did an economic analysis when it came to expanding the right to vote, and I agree, of course, but I'm not sure the right to vote necessarily is. I'm not really sure how much of an economic issue that is. I think that when we're talking about business ownership, though, naturally this is more of an economic issue. Now we might say that the consequences of giving more people, of enfranchising more people, might have economic consequences because they might vote for certain economic policies. But I feel like there is probably a meaningful difference there. That's kind of beside the point, though. I'm not really interested in that analogy. It's more so that you mentioned that I just don't think that there's additional risk, right? You mentioned France, right, where people buy essentially equity in their businesses. They're not cooperatives, to be fair. Those are stock ownership plans. A lot of businesses have stock ownership plans for employees. I think I want to say that I think I read a stat somewhere that was like 7 to 10% of all U.S. stock is owned by basically employees that just buy stock of the companies they live in or the companies they work at. So that already kind of exists in our system. But those aren't worker cooperatives. I think that when you talk about the primary means of investment being the stock market, that's true and it's not true. The business equity is not, it's kind of a, it's, I'm not sure how old it is as a concept, but you say, I don't see what's so wrong about people owning a part of their business. I don't necessarily see a problem with that either. I just think that it should be voluntary or it should be encouraged. I'm not sure it should be required. This is where you run into these structural issues. You talk about the risk, right? Obviously, it's risky when you're parking a bunch of money, a bunch of your investment into one single asset, being the ownership in a business, right? So, for instance,
but how is that
obviously
happening?
How is what happening?
If you're a worker and you turn 18 and you want to go get a job, how does an all-worker cooperative economy mean that your involvement in the workplace is going to entail more risk?
Because when you take a job at a worker cooperative, you're becoming a member of that cooperative. You're a part owner of that cooperative. Now, that ownership can either require buy-in or some sort of external, sourcing. Some people talk about government grants or cooperative banking or something to give people the capital in order to buy into worker cooperatives or consumer cooperatives. You're not talking about consumer cooperatives, to be fair, and that's perfectly reasonable. But nonetheless, though, all of that investment, all of that wealth of a worker is now necessarily tied into a single business within a single industry. That's a lot more risky than like a diversified portfolio. This is why there's I would say, this is why there's a wing of socialists that don't necessarily advocate for worker ownership, and it's more about social wealth funds and stuff like that. Because at least an advantage of social wealth fund socialism is that the investments in the means of production are diversified across an entire population instead of a single business. You can see how a single business investment would be a lot more risky than like a broad market index.
But you don't need to invest in anything. You don't need to buy in. We have co-ops. You can just join them.
Well, we have, as far as I'm aware, every cooperative kind of does it differently, and I'm not really sure about the cooperatives of the world. To be fair, I know that you mentioned France, where they're not cooperatives; those are stock ownership plans. They absolutely do buy in, but as you also mentioned, it's not required to work there. You don't have to actually be an equity owner to work at those businesses. So every cooperative is different. I think that with regard to the idea of just getting rid of ownership as a concept and just basically you work at a place and you just get a democratic say and then you distribute the profits either back into the business or, back into the workers' pockets if that's what they want. I think that there are probably some issues with this in general. I mean, I think that, on one hand, you're talking about not owning the business at that point, really, right? You have democratic say, but it's not ownership of the means of production, right? You can be fired at any time based on a democratic say. The cumulative capital growth and expansion of that business. Well, I mean, according to you, basically nobody would own it, right? It would be it would just be like I don't know, it would just be a legal entity that people worked at or didn't work at, right?
Yeah, absolutely. If you join a worker cooperative, there would be a kind of internal share. You divvy it up like pirate booty. If you had 5 people, it would go 5 ways. 10, and it would go 10 ways. I don't know why you would need to buy in necessarily. Now, you could have systems where people could buy in. I'm not saying there aren't cooperatives that do that. There are. But I don't think it's like a necessary thing. If you had like, for example, cooperatives that were just, I mean, if cooperatives were like normalized, I mean, if this was like the predominant economic model, I don't think they'd be expecting like 18-year-olds to just pay in like $20,000 to get their first kick. We're not talking about partnership or whatever. We're just talking about they would go there and, after I imagine some brief probationary period to make sure they're not, trolling, I guess. They would have a say in the internal vote, and they would be, I imagine, entitled to some portion of annual profits distributed across. Usually for these, the workers are entitled to like a percentage of profits split across however many people there are working there. And, the individual pay structures vary massively according to these co-ops. But I think this entails essentially the same level of risk. You're correct, though. Nobody really owns the business, which is exactly how our government works. No person owns the White House. No person owns, the Capitol Hill. They're institutions that we constructed that people can work in. There are people whose job it is to work in those facilities and people who are in charge of them, but not really ownership. And I think that's a respectable model, because that model means that the system through which those institutions are regulated, it can't just be the one whose name is on the deed. It has to be something more substantive than that. Obviously, our government's a shit show, so I'm not idealizing that, but I do like the fact that we have, at least nominally, a democracy, and I think businesses would work quite well the same, if for no other reason than because the total development of this system would, lead to the elimination of private capital ownership, which I think is very politically necessary.
Well, sure, but can you really say that you own the means of production when your ownership, when that's sort of, when that surplus value is sort of accumulated within a distinct entity versus actually having not say, but actually having ownership of that value increase over time? So for instance, what I mean by that is that, say that you work at a business and that business goes from being worth $100,000 to $400,000. Well, under an equal ownership model that I'm describing, or like some sort of buy-in model that I'm describing, your ownership in that business, your work in that business, obviously under a reasonable framework, has increased the value of that business from 100,000 to 400,000. Right, your wealth has quadrupled with regard to your investment in this business, right? But if the capital stock of that business, you have no right to it. Well, I'm not necessarily sure if we could really call that ownership, right?
It's not ownership in a capitalistic.
Oh, it was just, you get what I'm saying,
right?
Yeah.
It's not ownership in a capitalistic method, but that's kind of the point. Democratic control, if you would prefer. Ownership of the means of production, when used by Marx, was more of a class distinction, that the worker is in control, owned in the same way that you could say that the citizens of a country own their government, you know. Though we don't generally say that because we're quite disillusioned with democracies, at least domestically at the moment. But yeah, that's the principle to me. And there are co-ops that function this way, you know. Obviously, with regards to the structure of cooperatives, like who is legally responsible if something goes wrong, or who is responsible for like financial matters if the business goes insolvent. We have cooperatives that solve that already without having any private ownership. These are usually roles. You could think of it as kind of stewardship of the estate, similar as to what you would do with a house that you don't own but take care of. You know, it's yours to take care of, yours to manage. But you can do all of this without relying on the capitalist model of ownership.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I guess we can kind of leave that there for now. I don't. Well, it's not leave it there, but I think that I can move on to something that might be a little bit more substantive. So, if we're purely just talking about sort of democratizing, the workplace and industry in general, well, then I'm not really sure how that can't necessarily be accomplished actually under a capitalist framework. Now, to be fair, under my framework, capital owners would still have some sort of proportional say, right? If you buy stock in a business, you're still going to get a vote on how that business is run to a certain extent, right? But I think under a model where you've got 50% worker board membership and unionization and incentives for worker cooperatives, I'm really not sure how workers are necessarily worse off in the system, right? What's the why would it necessarily be wrong for a worker to be able to have the option to work at a business where they have, 50% worker board membership and they're represented by a union versus a cooperative? Why is that? Why should that necessarily be precluded? Why should that option be precluded from them in society when it's, a similarly democratic framework?
How is it similarly democratic?
Well, if you elect half of the board members and you're represented by a union, right? I feel like a lot of the concern of socialists is not an unreasonable concern, right? The idea that employees, or I'm sorry, not employees, but the idea that companies to a certain extent have monopsony power. They're able to over leverage their ownership in such a way that's harmful to the workers working there, either in the form of lower benefits, worse working conditions, less pay, right? Generally getting treated like shit by their their bosses and stuff like that. That's a reasonable concern. I think that things like unionization and worker board membership can basically get rid of those concerns in whole part. And also, if we're talking about a system where they do have the option to work at cooperatives if they really want to, I don't really see why that's a system that's necessarily sort of exploitative to the workers.
I don't know how half of a democracy is the same as a democracy. If you had a Congress where half of the seats were just appointed foreign ministers with no democratic involvement, you couldn't fairly say that was a democratically chosen legislator, right? I mean, in practical terms, if
Really quick though, just to jump in though,
uh,
my value here isn't wholly democracy, right? When it comes to democratizing the workplace, that's not necessarily a bad goal. But
would you
I
live
don't
under a
think that.
king?
Well, no, that's the next thing that I was going to say. The next sentence was that I'm not sure that sort of running civil society or sort of that social construct under a democratic framework is quite the same as running a business under a democratic framework. I'm not sure if the principle necessarily should cross apply there, and that's why I'm trying to differentiate between the two. I'm not sure the analogies make as much sense.
I think they're different, but in meaningful ways, they're very similar. In both instances, after all, you have institutions that have a huge amount of control over a person's life. The goal of systems which are larger than us is to align the interests of the people in charge of those systems with the interests of the people who must suffer the consequences of those systems. So, in terms of our government, the idea of voting in representatives is that if the representatives act in our interests and do things that make us happy, we continue to vote them in. And if they don't, we vote against them. Thus, at least ideally, it's in their interest to act in our interest. And of course, that doesn't fucking work, but it works better, I suppose, than the Communist Party of China would, or, a comparable authoritarian government. The issue that we have with economic authoritarianism is that the interests of the worker and of the owner are diametrically opposite. It is the interest of the worker to make as much money as possible and to have as much control over the place in which they work as possible. And the owners, well, the same, but for themselves. And those are opposite goals. Now, of course, you can ameliorate this unions do a little bit to balance out the scales of power, a situation in which corporations will naturally have more power because they're an institution and a worker is just a person. But it doesn't change the fundamental relationship, which is one of antagonism. I think that the ultimate goal of democracy isn't just make number go up or even to make workers happier. It's to really align the institutions in our country with the needs of the people who work in those institutions. And a consequence that we have of not doing this is that in your case, if you had like 50% controlled by like shareholders, 50% by the workers, then all it would take is one worker to be bought by the shareholders for them to have essentially full control of the board. Any real decision making the shareholders are going to mostly agree on, at least relative to the workers, because the workers have diametrically opposite goals of the shareholders because they make their money in different ways. They wouldn't have to buy off very many people at all for them to have essentially full control of the government. And so far, from what I can see, at least in Germany, evidence has shown that partial worker control of the board doesn't really do that much to affect worker involvement in the processes of the corporation. Now, I think they have 20 to 80. 50 to 50 would be more significant. I'd be interested to see any research on that. But I think principally it's just not far enough, especially if your goal, as it is with mine, the elimination of the bourgeois, the separate capital class, which can't really be done until every person in the country or on Earth has the same relationship to the means of production. They have to make their money in the same way. Because otherwise, you have situations where very small numbers of very powerful people have diametrically opposed material interests to the rest of the country. You have these issues in government right now where you have all these really, really bad precedents being set, where there's a union of corporate and government interests that lead to, well, it leads to something, but often it doesn't lead to stuff that's in the interest of the people necessarily.
Yeah, I think that you say something that's interesting. In meaningful ways, they're the same. The idea of a sort of a civic government versus the way you're governed at a corporation. Um, but also in meaningful ways, they're different, right? You mentioned the idea that if we have representatives, we vote against them. That's a good thing. Well, obviously, you could say the exact same thing with a worker board or a union, right? Unions are oftentimes democratically run to a certain extent. There's union elections, right? You have union representatives, you have union presidents. Oftentimes, I'm not sure of any unions that operate any differently. To be fair, obviously, when a union goes on a strike, for instance, that's something that has to be voted on by the union members, the workers, stuff like that, right? And so, to me, this sort of optional representation exists under my system as well. The difference is that I think my system is just generally more efficient. And ultimately, again, I think I have to keep going back to that. Some
What do you mean
workers
by
would just
efficient?
prefer. Well, I think that you get rid. I think it's more of a balancing act, I would say, right? So I think that there's generally been fairly favorable results when governments have to work with different sort of corporate boards and stuff, negotiating process. And I think there's also good sort of results, and there's good evidence to say that when a union negotiates with a company, oftentimes they generally tend to meet in the middle and have end up getting better benefits and pay and stuff like that. And I think that similarly, if you're unsatisfied with your union representation, you can elect new ones, and if you're unsatisfied with your worker board representation, you can also elect new ones. You
Why not
mentioned
cut out the
that.
middleman?
Well, because I think capital investment is has a reasonable seat at the table if they offer that investment in the first place, and the managers or the current owners or whoever is running that business in the first place agrees to that investment. I think it's a fine thing for a company to say, hey, we're taking your money and this money comes with it some sort of actionable decision-making capacity. Now, to be fair, a shareholder ultimately, like, what's the ultimate authority that a shareholder has over a business? Well, it's the board membership elections in the first place. That's like the most direct authority that a shareholder has over a corporation. For instance, if you bought Shell stock tomorrow, you can't just walk into Shell headquarters and act like you're the owner of the place. Technically, you are, right? But really, your ownership typically just confers a vote on the board, right, and the influence thereof. And I think that giving that same exact influence over to all the influence that we would be scared of from a socialist perspective, right? That business owners are, exerting their influence in the form of these board elections. Well, we're just giving the exact same sort of influence over to workers, and I think that makes for
We're not
more
scared of
valuable
power,
paradigm.
only who has it. We're not
That's
afraid
what I'm
of
saying.
the
Yeah.
idea of people having that decision-making power. Um, a couple of things.
No, no,
First of
no,
all,
that's not what I'm saying. No, no. So really quickly, that's not what I'm saying though. What I'm saying is that the effects of that ownership is really, necessarily the thing that is worrisome under a socialist framework, right? I'm just saying that those same powers can be transferred to workers, and they would necessarily have a better seat at the negotiating table. I had two more quick points. You mentioned that Germany has 80-20. As far as I'm aware, Germany also has 50-50. It's 50-50 for like big businesses, if I'm not mistaken. And then they go from there. Boards are actually relatively small. So, if a corporate board is like 8 people, it's not the most bureaucratic nightmare to elect another 8 people to that board, just be, worker representatives. You mentioned the idea that it would only take one worker to be swayed by the shareholders. Well, similarly, it'd only take one shareholder to be, or only one like shareholder elected board member to be swayed by the workers or the more activist shareholders, which is, can happen under today's framework and has happened under today's framework. And the last thing you mentioned was that, I think this is maybe a way we can take it as well, is that the interests of workers and owners are fundamentally opposed. I would say the same thing about all trade relationships, right? The interests of like the United States and Canada are fundamentally opposed when you're talking about negotiating a trade deal. Now, we could frame it that way, but I think that there is a joint interest there, and that joint interest can create sort of net value, right? That plug and play or give and take, I should say, between like Canada and America is very valuable. And I think similarly, there's a lot of value created when there is a give and take between like a union and a corporation. That's why it doesn't tend to be the case that workers that are represented by unions tend to be worse or less productive. But it does tend to be the case that despite those companies being able to maintain their profits and efficiency, it does tend to be the case that workers feel more satisfied, they get more benefits, they get more wages. And I think a similar sort of more, I would analyze it more like a trading relationship than just, oh, you have diametrically opposed interests. And I think that lens of analysis is probably more useful when looking at policy and these types of relationships in the first place.
A couple of things. I think it's really odd that you would claim that it's more efficient to promote unions, which are just an extension of the antagonistic interests of the working class relative to the business owners, when unions are nothing more than a facsimile for the fact that owners don't have control itself. This is one of the issues I have, and you don't seem to understand. 50-50 isn't enough. Shareholders can have zero control. You say, like, well, there's a chance that workers could sway over one shareholder. I don't care. I don't want to live in a government where 50% of the legislature is foreign appointed officials and we have to just sway one of them. That's not acceptable to me. It's democracy or it's not. In terms of efficiency, I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that direct worker control is inefficient. In fact, it seems to cut at the problem immediately by directly addressing the interior antagonisms, the power relationship between the workers and the owners having diametrically opposite interests. And I'd be interested in seeing how, in a system with full capital investiture relegated to worker cooperatives, non-controlling shares and what have you, how effectively something like that could be implemented. Because I think there are a lot of inefficiencies in traditional autocratic ownership, just as autocracies are inefficient in almost every large institution. Whether you're talking about mercantile corporations or dictatorial states, kingdoms, whatever, authoritarianism tends to carry with it a number of inefficiencies for a great many reasons. An unfamiliarity with the work being done at the ground level, and the lack of sympathy towards the interests of those beneath you, the consumption of ideology on the part of the capital owners, which leads to them doing disastrous things out of some, I guess what you'd call buying your own hype, like when the Sears guy it turned his businesses into that like ANCAP paradise and everything failed,
Yeah.
stuff like that. So yeah, I don't I think it's democracy or bust, really. With regards to capital ownership necessarily conferring control, I don't see why it should. The bank, after all, doesn't get to control a house just because they signed off on the loan for it. Now, of course, if you can't pay your payments back, then you can foreclose and the house can go to them. But in terms of management of the house, while it is yours to control, the bank gets no say. I don't know why buying into or investing into something should necessarily confer any control over how that institution is run. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
With regards to the trade relationship analogy, I think that trade is fine when you're talking about two institutions of equal institutional power leveraging out things between them, but I don't think it works as well when it's institutions which control a great many people trying to fight with those people from what they can get. I mean, we see this in government, for example. We certainly don't have, at least ideally, an adversarial relationship with everything our government does. Like, we ideally the interests should be aligned, because the better our lives are, the more productive we are, and the more likely we are to vote in people who probably want to stay in there for a second, third, fourth, fifth term. Uniting the interests is efficiency. It is efficient to cut through those middlemen. And I don't see the issue with full worker control. The last point that I want to make is, you
Yeah.
ask what's wrong with the worker wanting to work at a more traditionally managed business? And my answer to that would be, I don't care. In the United States, you can't sign yourself into indentured servitude nor slavery, and I'm fine with that. I think that there are plenty of economic situations where people can be forced into, even if it's for their immediate benefit, conferring their freedom upon a system which does not owe it. And I think that's a bad thing. I think it's okay to categorically prohibit anti-democratic systems.
Yeah, sure. So, uh, just writing some stuff down. So yeah, so I just to go one by one on these. You mentioned that unions are nothing more than a representation that capitalists don't have all the power, right? As a counterbalance to that, because the consequences of that would be bad. Sort of, I'm almost begging the question by saying that I'm in favor of union membership or worker board representation. Not necessarily. I mean, I'm fairly open with saying that I think that democratic structures, whether it be through unions or worker board membership, are a good thing, right? For instance, you mentioned the idea that authoritarianism is inefficient. You have a lack of sympathy. There's a local knowledge problem there. These things are solved by the structures that I advocate for. That goes into the idea that you mentioned that what do you call it? There's no evidence that worker ownership is necessarily inefficient. What there is evidence of is that the efficiency gains and the productivity gains of worker cooperatives are not necessarily homogenous. Every study that I've looked at with regard to worker-owned businesses or employee-managed businesses and their relative productivity or profitability or whatever have you, pretty much often I've never seen a study that doesn't tend to say that these results were not homogenous across industries. Some industries did better than others. What I found consistently in the data was remarkable inconsistency with how well worker enterprises did, which isn't to say that they're bad. It's just to say that depending on when the study was done, depending on where the study was done, and depending on the industries that were looked at, worker managed businesses tended to do better and worse depending on all three of those factors. For instance, in the northern Italian region, Emilia Romagna, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, where a huge portion of the economy is cooperatively managed and organized. It's still only about 10% of workers that work for cooperatives. These are mostly producer cooperatives, which means they're heavy in the agricultural industry, and then most every other business is not cooperatively run. That's in one of the most incentivized, sort of culturally favorable environments for cooperatives. And so I think that the idea that this would necessarily lead to efficiency gains, I'm sure is a bit dubious, especially when it's mandated. I think that you'd end up in a system where you're incentivizing them. You'd end up in a system where worker cooperatives sort themselves into the industries that they do best in, and I think that that's probably better, not just for the economy, obviously, but generally for everyone, right? That when the economy is efficient, it's generally better for everyone, especially under a democratic framework where a lot of those gains are redistributed in the first place. The next couple things you mentioned, that banks don't get a say in how your house is run because they lent you money. Well, obviously this is a debt market, not an ownership market, right? So I mean, you agreed to lend me money. You didn't agree to sell me the ownership in the house necessarily, right? I own the house. You just gave me the money to buy it, right? That's why there's a difference there. If you're talking about you could raise capital just through debt in a worker cooperative society or non-voting shares, I think that there's probably some capital formation problems there. Raising capital is a really powerful tool for the economy, and I think in a system where you're either primarily reliant on banks or entirely reliant on banks, I think is probably a system worse than we have now. You mentioned that with regard to trade, it's not good to have an entirely adversarial relationship, right? But I think that you can absolutely have this in trade agreements with different nations, right? No, so nations trade with each other when they do have entirely adversarial interests, right? Despite the fact that we have an entirely adversarial relationship with China, we do still trade with them quite a lot, despite all the tariffs and stuff that have been, engaged in. I wouldn't say that trade itself is bad. I might just say that that particular relationship is bad and probably warrants some sort of endogenous or exogenous force, right? Similarly to how I could agree that many workplaces are bad, but I wouldn't say that it's like the relationship itself that is inherently the problem. And I'd make the exact same argument with trade. You mentioned the last thing you mentioned was that in the U.S. you can't sign yourself up for slavery or for indentured servitude. I just have to reject the analogy in general here. I've seen socialists say this a lot. I don't think that. I don't think working at like I don't think getting a job at like Starbucks or something. I don't think that that's the same as being like a chattel slave or being an indentured servant. And I'm not even I don't even think you'd necessarily say that they are the same. You're just drawing an analogy. I just think the analogy is so off base here that it's hard to really reconcile with. And also, to be fair, you can indeed in America work for free, right? But you still have the same rights as any worker. It's called an internship, right? You can also volunteer your time and things like that.
Don't
That's
worry.
not to say that
We'll make those illegal too.
yeah, sure. But I'm just saying that the analogy I think breaks down fundamentally, and I think that ultimately it's sort of emblematic of the lack of flexibility. Internships aren't necessarily the worst thing in the world, to offer people to do. You and I both have probably known many people who have springboarded successful careers based off of internships they were able to get when they were younger. And I don't think that is necessarily the worst thing. But I also don't think it's anywhere close to being a slave.
They are the same. It's a continuation of a historical form. Types of labor which deny autonomy to the working class. It was more explicit under slavery and under indentured servitude, when you could get away with that. And there are plenty of places that still have slavery and indentured servitude, of course, we're not done with that. But here in the United States, we have, at least for now, done away with those forms. But there's an underlying insidious nature to these systems which goes beyond just the explicit brutality of slavery. It is the fact that in those systems, as is the case with this system that we live in now, as a class, there is a political consequence to the denial of democratic rights. It goes beyond just being able to rearrange your Starbucks, like counter the way you want, or getting a little bit of extra money because you're entitled to a portion of profits. It means that when it comes to the people in this country who have the most power and make the most important decisions, they are overwhelmingly not workers. In a real democracy, this would not be the case, because a worker and an owner, or a member of the bourgeois, have very different economic interests. Very, very different. They make money in different ways. They benefit from different policies. They have an interest in different kinds of investment, different kinds of tax structures. These are incredibly important policy-based differences that will affect their reasoning over ours. And the issue is they're not just in government, of course. They obviously, by definition, run the corporations, and they overwhelmingly run and present at news media. This isn't conspiratorial, I hope. It's just true. That's what they do. And for that reason, essentially all political narrative making, all messaging that we get broadly in this country and in every other capitalist country is filtered through the lens of bourgeois interest, through their capital interest, through their class interest. And the political consequences of this are very real. My support of worker democracy goes well beyond I think people should be happier in their workplace. The issue is that as the way things stand right now, there are groups with different interests, and the group who has the other set of interests controls everything. We are not similar to the bourgeois. They do not share our interests. We have more in common. And I say we as though I'm a member of the working class as a live streamer, but let's just pretend for a moment that I'm speaking on behalf of the working class.
Technically you are, right?
Technically, but in terms of material,
I mean, you're part of the proletariat. Well, I don't. Well, I guess you're not, because you own a business. Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe I shouldn't say that.
No, I don't even have that
saying.
registered. Yeah, let's say that I, as a
you're in a gray area,
petite bourgeois labor aristocrat live streamer, I think I would have more in common with a, Taiwanese worker than Elon Musk in terms of material interest and what policies I would want passed for my government at the very least. So I think it's critical to think of things that way. When leftists talk about wage slavery, democracy, and all this, it sounds heady and, self-important and over-exaggerated. But, one of the big reasons why we're facing down the barrel of a climate crisis is because the media institutions in this country and others are largely put forward by people who are good friends with barons in the coal and oil industry, as are a lot of politicians. So the system we're in right now, I mean, we're staring down a couple billion deaths in a few decades. I mean, I think we're talking about the political divide here, between people who can build survival yachts and people who cannot, is going to become increasingly significant as time goes on, which is the reason why I don't even care to respond to your earlier points about non-homogeneous efficiency industry to industry. The economy can shrink for all I care. I think that it won't. I think that the evidence we have for worker cooperatives is largely earnest and optimistic. I want more evidence on this, of course. I want things to be implemented carefully and effectively. But even if things went down for a bit, much as the same way that I supported the American Revolution, even though that did lead to an immediate decrease in the economic productivity of the former colonies, I think there's something materially useful there that's difficult to put into a GDP chart.
Sure. Okay. I think that, yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, if you want to concede that, well, not concede, but if you want to, not, I don't want to say that frames it unfairly. If you want to say that basically it's irrelevant to me that the potential economic consequences of what I'm saying, that's fair enough. I mean, I understand that we make moral decisions in economics all the time, right? We don't allow we don't allow 8-year-olds to work at coal mines, right? Because we've decided that, yeah, that's just not okay,
But
right? Now, to be fair, yeah,
just to
go
be
on.
clear,
Sorry.
given the current info, I don't think there would be severe economic consequences. It's possible
No, I
that some
understand. Yeah,
industries would be, right. I want to say that that's not the thing I'm hung up on, but I don't want to give the impression that the evidence suggests there would be this, like economic
sure.
catastrophe.
Yeah, and that's why I rephrased myself, because I don't want to give the impression that you are giving that impression either. I would just say that with regard to the last point, I suppose, on the more economic side of the debate, I would just say that, and you might even agree with this, I would just say that the economy would be more productive if we had incentivized co-ops that can sort themselves out versus mandated co-ops. Now, obviously, to my point, I couldn't tell you how much less productive. I could just say that with relative confidence that it would just be less productive than otherwise would. Now, I would say that that's bad because it doesn't allow you to redistribute as much. Consumer prices probably go up. People might have less discretionary income. I think there's a lot of extrapolative effects from there that would be quite negative for society. But to be fair, without putting a number on it, you did say, to be fair, that if it was just truly so bad for the economy, you'd probably move off of your position. But I can't say how bad it is, so we can probably just leave it there. With regard to the more sort of
okay.
almost philosophical points, with regard to the more sort of philosophical points, you mentioned that there's political consequences to being denied these sort of voting rights in your company. To be fair, I might agree to a certain extent. That's why I'm in favor of democratic structures in the workplace. I'm just not in favor of this strict democratic structure for all those economic reasons. You say that people making the real decisions are not the working class; it's the bourgeois. But I'm not actually sure how true this is. Right? It seems to me, based on my sort of survey of the literature and what I've done, the median voter, the people that vote, tend to actually be fairly well represented. Now, we might say that, the median voter is disproportionately, you could say, just different in general from the sort of average working class person. And I might agree to that to a certain extent. I'm not sure exactly how true that is. I'd have to look at the statistics, but that's just to say that our democratic system works, right? And I would say that with regard to policy, I think people tend to get the policies that the people who vote tend to vote for.
Can I interject
that has
very
been,
briefly?
Yeah, go for it.
Where are these people educated on those policies from?
Well, they're educated in Marxist universities, Vosh.
But where are they really educated from?
I'm not sure. You have to. Are you talking about the news media or whatever? I was going to actually talk about that next.
Okay. This is manufacturing consent. The idea that people,
Yeah.
So for example, people in China broadly support their government. People in Nazi Germany broadly supported their government. People support what they're told is good to support, and some hegemonies go unquestioned. In the United States, the great America, the American exceptionalist capitalist country that, straddles the world, we are presented information in a narrativized manner. And I do think that influences what people think they ought to vote for. A lack of class consciousness.
Yeah, I think, yeah, so exactly. And this goes on to what I was about to say. I could tell you were kind of getting at the manufacturing consent issue. I think it's a valuable thing to bring up because it's a good point. It's a good narrative, I would say, by Chomsky and Herman, the oft forgot second author of manufacturing consent. But I think that the issue is that, at least from my reading of manufacturing consent, all the actual fundamental conditions of manufacturing consent would actually still exist in a market socialist system. It's just that the interests shift from, you could say, from like capital owners to just the worker owners, right? So, for instance, Chomsky and Herman talk about mass media adhering to owner demands. Well, obviously these owners still exist. It's just the workers instead of instead of capital owners. It's not to say that they wouldn't have their unique interests that might be at the detriment of society. They talk about, they link this in with the idea of the role of advertising dollars, how, advertising campaigns and advertising dollars heavily influence what we see and what we're told, and that this is a toxic relationship. Obviously, advertising cooperatives would still have all the same incentives under a market socialist system. They talk about the powerful bottleneck and gatekeep that mass media uses to control the narrative, that the powerful basically prevent you from being able to write stories because they have access to the powerful people. Well, this sort of lobbying effort would just shift from capital owners to worker owners. There's no reason why worker cooperatives wouldn't have their own special interests that they would lobby the government on behalf of. They talk about flack, the idea that you can get sued for reporting something that's considered controversial. Well, again, if you report something controversial about a huge cooperative, I can see why you might be scared of being sued by that huge cooperative, despite the fact that you're a cooperative and they're cooperative. And the last thing that I found from the book was that they talk about anti-communism or the war on terror as a means of social control, right? Well, all this sort of mass hysteria and government apparatuses could certainly still exist under a market socialist system. You talk about how in general that this relationship is necessarily toxic, but all of these same sort of fundamental structures would almost necessarily exist under a market socialist system. And the last thing that I would say is that you talk about people supporting what they're told, right? The core of manufacturing consent, right? People believe what they're told on the news media. But I think that there's some issues with this narrative. One is that it's pretty hard for news media to have like a ubiquitously true narrative, right? I mean, look at people do it all the time. Obviously, mass media courses, your first day, you might learn about how CNN and Fox News reporting on the same exact story are going to have totally different lenses of analysis, and this is true with regard to pretty much every issue. It's not quite a homogenous media landscape. Now, you might say it's homogenous in the term of supporting capital owners, but I'm really not sure what that means in this regard. I mean, obviously there's progressive news media networks, there's progressive shows, there's right-wing shows that are very anti sort of corporate. Obviously we the very very anti big business Tucker Carlson, right? Even though he's obviously a bit of a crazy guy, but you get what I'm saying though. That I don't really buy the argument that while at the same time these capital owners are truly controlling everything and truly manufacturing consent. It seems like they're quite bad at it because it seems like all the most of the systems we've implemented with regard to sort of social spending and worker rights and stuff like that have been fairly robust over time. It seems like they can't really get quite a homogenous narrative on the news media. And to be fair, all the problems associated with that would still exist under a market socialist system.
So a few points.
Yep.
With regards to, okay.
Go for it.
You're correct in saying that the leaders of worker cooperatives would continue to act in and lobby for their material interests. But there's a critical distinction there, actually several. The largest of which is that they would be advocating solely for their business, not for the bourgeois as a class. The issue right now is that the shareholders and CEOs of every corporation on Earth fundamentally share essentially the same relationship to their governments and the policies that they want passed. Because the ultra-wealthy, who make their money off the back of other laborers' work, they share a lot of characteristics in common. Obviously, wealth is one of them. The way in which they make their money, the way in which they tend to be taxed, those are big ones. But more critically, they're insulated from the material interests of the working class and of the poor. Meaning that, or to put it another way, if in a worker cooperative society you had, cooperative Exxon, who found evidence of climate change in the 1970s, lied about it, burned the papers, and then, denied. I think there's a huge difference between them doing so individually as a cooperative, solely in favor of their own interest, their own selfish desire to preserve their company, as opposed to them working in tandem with the broader business class, which is exactly what happened, If you take a look right now at how these narratives are promoted, it's not just the coal industry fights for the coal industry. It's the wealthy as a group, not in totality, but at least in significant enough numbers that it becomes more than just Exxon doing this stuff. They act in unison. They have class consciousness. They fall in line because at the end of the day, the systems that allow Exxon to keep power are the systems that allow essentially the rest of them to keep power. None of them want regulation. None of them want the federal government looking too closely into how their businesses run. None of them want the EPA to have more power than they already do, because the EPA's power is always going to be to the detriment, or at least overwhelmingly so, of these corporations. It goes beyond the interest just of this company and turns into a broader class-based interest. I think transparency would also be a big one. In a authoritarian firm, let's take again Exxon, if they wanted to do research on climate change, burn the documents, climate change isn't real, lie. In an authoritarian firm, you can get away with that. Tell everyone involved in the process that their ass is grass if they come out with it, and that's that. It's internal corporate research. There's no legal, whatever. You get to keep. Hey, enjoy your $300,000 a year job in the Cayman Islands. Have fun. Just don't ever talk about this. In a democratically run business, of course, the millions of people who work directly or indirectly for this company might be really negatively affected by the idea of ending the world, which would affect them directly because they can't afford the yacht palaces that the wealthy people who run an authoritarian corporation might be able to. Transparency is a necessary component of democracy. And for that reason, that means not only do you have more potential for whistleblowers, you also have more potential for dissident within the institution itself. And any CEO or any head leader or whatever of, democratically controlled Exxon would quickly find themselves out of a job if it was found out by the hundreds of thousands of people who worked beneath them that they were bringing the planet to a state which would soon lead to the flooding of the places that they currently live in. I know that sounds a bit idealistic, but I genuinely believe that would be the case absent the
Wow.
decades of misinformation that we've seen concerning climate change. And if you don't think they can push narratives when they need to, a third of Americans don't believe in climate change. That is insane. There's no reason to not believe in climate change. It's like a 100-0 issue. It's very straightforward. But because of a dedicated media campaign over decades, not only is this like a big subject of debate here, we can't even do anything about it federally because the Republican Party is principally against any kind of climate change action because the Senate is always going to be disproportionately rural voted and thus red. So now what was originally one company lying turned into the media in bed with that company promoting disinfo, turned into an entire political party opposing any action on the subject, which will, as we'll find out in a few decades, end most human life. So I think this is directly downstream of the lack of transparency and the lack of oversight and the lack of control working class people have over these big institutions. Which is why you see whistleblowing a lot more commonly in democratic governments as opposed to authoritarian governments. Any system where you give more leeway for the common people to second guess, to double check, to see what's really happening, you get more opportunities to have these big conspiracies or big problems like busted wide open, So would cooperative ownership fix lobbying and corporate interest? It absolutely would not. But I think there are ways in which it would be meaningfully different, and those are the main ways.
So just to get it clear, the main ways would be transparency, and maybe I missed the first way. Well, what's like the distinct two things besides what's the other thing besides transparency? Oh, the class itself, right?
Transparency, oversight, and they could only ever lobby in favor of their business, not in favor of themselves as an economic class, as the bourgeois.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So yeah, okay. So I think I can respond to each of these. So, you talk about, they'd only be arguing in favor of their business, not the sort of bourgeois as a class, right? But I would say that there'd still be distinct class interests in this society, right? I mean, obviously, most socialists aren't of the persuasion anymore, the idea that everyone would be truly equal, right? Or nor the idea that everyone would have like some sort of perfect distribution or flat management of their cooperative, right? So there'd still be managerial classes under your system, and there would still be a material interest differentiating many different people depending on where they worked, what kind of cooperative they worked at, and frankly, just where they grew up. Obviously, just their own political persuasion, right? There'd still be distinct class interests that could have toxic effects on the sort of political orientation of local politics, and perhaps have an outsized influence, or perhaps even just a straight up negative influence on national politics. So I think that that's still would exist. You use the example of cooperative Exxon might have still destroyed the evidence for climate change, but we wouldn't have seen any sort of broader apparatus of action as a result of this. I really don't see why not, right? If every oil company was a cooperative, there's no reason to think why the cooperative oil companies of the day wouldn't have the same exact material interest to destroy that evidence and go from there. This kind of leads into your idea that none of the bourgeois want EPA regulations, worker safety regulations, regulations in general. To which I would just say, well, obviously, the same types of cooperatives wouldn't have this. They'd have the exact same incentive structure to not want those things as well. If you're a cooperative who, for instance, relies heavily on contracted labor, maybe you're contracting from a cooperative, but you're still just incentivized to not want, worker regulations or safety regulations, things like that. You're still just incentivized to destroy the environment and not want the EPA. The material interest still exists. Moving on to your transparency point, I'm not really sure that this is necessarily true, right? We're assuming that every worker cooperative is a flat, pure sort of pure democracy, which I'm not sure we would reasonably assume, especially if it's true that worker cooperatives could actually be big, right? When you see like Mondragon, for instance, which is sort of the classic example of large-scale cooperative organization, they have a representative democracy, and only 29-30% of their employees are actually members of their cooperative because it has such a problem with scaling. But that's more of an economic point, and we're kind of moving on from there. But that's just to say that obviously the upper management of Mondragon would certainly be able to relatively easily keep secrets from the sort of lower, more entry level, or perhaps the workers who aren't involved in the representative council of democracy. I'm not sure why we'd expect necessarily that worker cooperatives would be more transparent, even internally, than regular old businesses. You're right that I would probably be willing to concede that they're probably more internally transparent, but just because we have a relatively transparent democracy in most every country, every country still has intelligence agencies. They still have secrets that they keep for national security reasons. And I think similarly, you pull back the Exxon example here, which is to say that if the workers of worker cooperative Exxon found out that their managers, which they'd be more likely to find out that their managers are hiding this information from the public, they would fire their managers for trying to keep this a secret. I actually don't agree at all with this. I don't think they'd be likely to fire them at all. There might be some sort of sanctions, there might be a suspension, but I don't think that material interest fundamentally changes. I don't think that there would be some uproar that would cause worker cooperative Exxon to be more environmentally conscious. No, not at all. This leads into your last point, which is the idea that there's no reason not to believe in climate change. I agree that there's no scientific reason. I certainly agree with that. And I think that's probably what you meant to say, but there's absolutely a material reason for people not to believe in climate change. For instance, the material interest of coal workers, right? They're incentivized not to take this seriously, not to believe in it. And they're incentivized because of the huge moral hazard that exists with regard to pollution and sort of environmental degradation in general, right? Environmental degradation that's caused by a select group of people is never going to only hurt that select group of people. So while they're profiting from environmental degradation, everyone else is sort of spreading across that harm. And if anything, they might be disproportionately not hurt by it. For instance, they might be wealthy enough to build seawalls or wealthy enough to move to areas that aren't low lying and not flooded, right? So there's all of these dynamics at play that would actually lead, in my opinion, to a society with regard to the information dissemination of climate change not being fundamentally different than today. I'm not sure that those numbers would actually change at all. All the same things exist under your system. The material interest causes all of these things to exist, and that fundamental material interest is not by any means, in my opinion, really significantly addressed. I'll give you half a point on the transparency thing. That's probably true, but I really don't think it would lead to a far different outcome. And the last thing that I would say is that I'm not sure that we would even necessarily expect a far different outcome from, or in terms of the transparency, in terms of all the, the class interests and all that stuff. I don't really think we'd expect a far different outcome from my system, which is unionization and worker board membership, right? When you've got workers representing half of all boards, you'd probably get all the same transparency benefits. But like I said, I'm not sure we can necessarily kick ourselves out of the material interest. I think that what that requires is a broad and a deep democratic structure nationally, which is what we have now. And to be fair, which is shown to be fairly robust, right? We still have the EPA environmental regulations that tend to get better and better over time. We're cutting emissions, right? So, I think that broad democratic structure in our government is really what solves those sort of individual material interests, not actually transforming our economy into a worker sort of cooperative oriented economy.
First of all, EPA regulations have been getting gutted, and their most recent gutting was because a member of the bourgeois who had a material incentive to oppose EPA regulations was put in charge with the EPA. So, yeah, I mean, I wish it was getting better with time. They could do a lot better. I think one of the issues I have here is because I often feel
Yeah.
like opposition to the glorious worker social, market socialist society that I advocate for. Um, sometimes it's presented as like a policy thing, but I think it's actually quite ideological. I disagree with you on a lot of these things
Yeah.
here.
Well,
The
I feel like, well, to be fair though, let me just jump in there. I feel like I didn't, it wasn't a very empirical response, right? I did give a fairly ideological sort of, teasing it out type response. I'm talking about material interests and things like that. I'm not quoting any data when I give that response, right?
No, no, of course, of course. And when it comes to stuff like this, it's difficult too. But I feel like it's the ideology again. With regards to like material interest, coal miners would still argue against climate change. When we take a look at people who oppose or who don't believe in climate change in the U.S., we're talking about people who do so because they watch Fox News, not because they're like coal miners or oil rig workers who, because there's a difference between not believing in climate change and not thinking we should do anything about it. If the argument was really about whether or not we should do anything about it, then that would be what they would promote over Fox News or whatever. But instead, it's about disbelieving it in general. I think that generally workers in the coal industry in America are generally in favor of stronger ecological regulations. And what's more, I think if you take a look at plenty of other countries in the world, they have oil workers, they have coal workers. They don't have this big debate about climate change. Like, would there still be people who would argue against climate change or who would, disbelieve in it because they're conspiracy theorists? Sure, but not like a third of the population. That was very, very deliberately a product of disinfo pushed by the bourgeois. And the only reason the news companies lied for Exxon and lied for all of them is because Murdoch is like buddy-buddy with them. They're all golf buddies. They have shared capital interests. Sometimes they literally mutually invest, but I don't believe in mutual investment. In my system, there would be no way for a person who runs the news stations to also have a huge stake in the oil companies. There would be no way for a single person to have this vertical control over all the systems by which they can disseminate information, from having semi-control over the oil being taken from the earth, to how the news promotes the interests of those industries broadly, to being friends with politicians to make sure regulations don't go through. That won't be possible. I don't think there's any reason Co-op News Company would lie for Co-op Exxon, except for like the possibility that the elected leaders of both of those corporations, for some reason, despite not being ultra-wealthy plutocrats who visit Epstein's Island because they wouldn't be paid that much more than the average worker, would be like personal friends. And that personal friendship would then have to involve a conspiracy where they would collaborate information in both groups and disseminate it through thousands of employees on both ends of things in order to promote misinformation. I just don't think it's possible. We know that transparency is much easier to arrive at in democratic systems. We see this clearly. According to China, they had like 200 COVID deaths. Can you prove that they didn't? I can't. The more democratic a system is, the lower the consequences are for speaking out, the more likely info is to get out. Right now, in basically every corporation in America, if you do anything they don't like, they can just fire you. They can blacklist you from the industry, depending on how high up you are. If you're like a middle manager who like gives indications of wrongdoing, they're not just going to fire you. Nobody else is ever going to hire you. Why would they? They know you're a rat. They would never, ever, ever do it. Whereas that couldn't happen in this system because firing would be done democratically. And those like leaders in co-op Exxon would have to convince the people whose job it is to fire you for leaking the fact that your corporation is doing a thing that will lead to their children being homeless in 30 years. Like the systems just don't line up. We know authoritarianism is inefficient. We see this. This can be born empirically. So we need to hit this at the root of the problem. It's not enough to preserve the bourgeois and just give the workers breadcrumbs. We can't give them, this weak half measure. Capital investment should just be done away with. We can find ways to replace these systems without allowing different economic interests to fester in different groups. I know we can. We have co-ops. We know forms of investment outside of controlling shares exist. That was like the majority of investment for a long time. The stock market is a relatively new thing. And while controlling shares as a concept have been around for a long time, like that's far from the only thing we have,
I get what you're saying. So I would, to respond sort of line by line here, bring it back to the broader point. You mentioned that EPA regulations have been gutted. So I would say broadly, they actually haven't. Now, we have seen some ebb and flow here. Don't get me wrong. Obviously, Trump did appoint a coal lawyer as the head of the EPA, which didn't exactly help anything. But, before that, there was, I think the last head of the EPA before Trump was a nuclear physicist or some sort of chemist or something like that. And then the head of the EPA right now is, I'm sure, just fine under Biden in a relative sense. Yale actually did a quote unquote environmental performance index, which tried to basically index all the sustainability and sort of environmental policies of governments over the course of a 10-year period. And what they found was that 70% of countries actually improved over the last decade to a significant degree, at least measurable based on their index. And these are obviously mostly, you might say that every country is a capitalist country, right? So that maybe it's a little bit, towards my point. To your next point, the idea that people don't believe in climate change because they watch Fox News. Well, I would say that again, that the niche of radical right-wing politics would still exist in, or even, you could say even reactionary politics would still exist in a market socialist system. That market would still be there because those people would still be there, right? And so that niche would still be filled by someone, right? It might be cooperative Fox News, but in general, I'm not sure we would necessarily say that couldn't exist. You say that there's no way that cooperative CNN would necessarily cooperate with cooperative Exxon. It's a lot of cooperatives there. But I would say that there is actually a reason that they would. Chomsky would say that it might be advertising dollars, right? It might be access to politicians and lobbying interests, right? That's something that Chomsky points out in manufacturing consent. So I don't see why it wouldn't necessarily be the case that certain wealthy cooperatives and certain, broadly popular news organizations, cooperative news organizations wouldn't necessarily, from their manager's perspective or from just their entire sort of class interest perspective, take these same sorts of views in their systems. For instance, you say, I think this sort of doesn't beg the question, but it sort of gives away the, gives away, I think it implicitly concedes to what sort of my frame of view would be, which would be that, other countries have coal workers, but they don't have the same problem with climate denial. Those other countries you're referencing are capitalist countries, right? And so I would actually agree that there are ways that capitalist systems can properly respond to this quote unquote manufacturing consent problem, or a dissemination of misinformation, or generally like a failure of our education system to a certain extent, like all the things that might cause American society to be more skeptical of climate change. I just don't think it's the fault necessarily of the I don't think it's the fault of people being able to buy shares of a business. That's fundamentally what we're talking about here, and I don't think that all of those problems can be fundamentally solved or shifted by getting away or by probably just getting rid of that sort of transaction in the first place.
Could we go point for point?
Yeah. Well, the last point I was going to make,
Okay.
sorry, the last 2 points was going to be that you mentioned transparency gains. Again, that transparency is fundamentally the thing that would solve these things. Well, you'd have all the same transparency gains with 50% worker board membership. They're an equal member of the board. They'd have all the access to the same files that anyone else would have access to. They'd have all the rights of board members. So there's no transparency gain under a worker cooperative system that wouldn't necessarily be afforded to a system with worker board membership. And the last thing you mentioned was that authoritarianism can be inefficient. That's why, I actually agree. And that's part of the reason why I'd advocate for democratic structures in the workplace. My only argument would be that having capital investment could actually lead to broader economic efficiencies that are better for all workers. So the first point I made was that the EPA regulations, I don't think we can say to a significant extent they've been gutted. That was, if you wanted to start there.
I'd say they have been. The EPA is like a laughably weak administration. It's incredibly weak. I mean,
Sure.
Maybe things get better with time, but it's I don't know. I mean, I don't think we should be in a position to praise the behavior of any environmental regulation agency when we're continuing to hurtle towards climate disaster. Like whatever bar there is for success, they are so far away from it that it's not even visible. It's over the horizon, I guess, or past
but it's
the
also
atmosphere.
It's also not just the EPA, right? We're talking about an entire sort of, you'd say worldly failure, but I would say there's a lot of hope with regard to environmental regulation on a world basis, and even in the United States, right? I mean, in the United States, for instance, based on our apparently weak, environmental regulation, per capita CO2 emissions have decreased since 1973, down 32%. Absolute CO2 emissions, the total amount that we emit as an economy, has been decreasing since the year 2000 as a broad trend.
You can't. Wait, I'm sorry.
Well,
you cannot be proud of these points when we're missing the scientist projection for carbon expansion that would lead to like a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. That
was the next thing I was going to say.
Right,
yeah.
This isn't enough. It can't be. We can't. This is not a metric for success.
No, I agree. The only point would be to say that I think that it does go against the idea that the APA has been slowly degraded over time. Actually, it really hasn't been, and I think that those regulations have been fairly robust. But again, there's an ebb and flow here. That's why what I was going to say, the last point was going to be that the IEA released they release a global energy outlook every single year. Obviously, the 2021 was the most recent year, and they've been tracking environmental progress for I'm not sure how long, probably ever since they started the report. To be honest, but what they found was that based on announced policies, right? So based on the policies that governments have committed to, that we're going to get about 60% of the way to net zero by 2050, and 2050 is the mark that I have seen broadly as this is when we need to be net zero by. And to be fair, that's not all the way there. That's only 60% of the way there. But we imagine that.
That's not.
Well, I was going to say, unless we imagine that technology is actually not going to get better at all, talking about battery storage, carbon capture specifically, and we imagine that number two, policies won't actually become any more aggressive. To be fair, there's no reason to expect that though, because that's been the trend for the last 40 years, right? So I think that there's a lot of hope with regard to the environmental policy.
Listening to you gives me the opposite of hope. The complacency that you're speaking with right now is exactly why we're in this position. Don't fundamentally change the system. Don't rock the boat. Tech will get better. Things are getting marginally better at a rate. I won't say how quick that rate is.
Well, don't neglect the last thing I said. The last thing I said was that policies. We have to assume that also policies won't become more aggressive. Now, I'd advocate for more aggressive environmental policies, right? But I would just say that those policies will probably end up happening over time, right? To be fair, none of us can say one thing or another. But what I would one last sentence was just to say that with regard to, I forgot my last point was. Fuck, you fucked me, Vosh.
I'm sure it'll come back.
Yeah,
Yeah,
go for it.
no, we're gambling on the civilization. We can't. This is like you. Oh well, the EPA's made great progress. We're at a position to reach just over half of the goal of the worst projected outcome scientists set, and maybe policies will change to make up the rest of the shortfall. Like, no, no, like we're
Yeah.
barreling down a cliff right now. There's no circumstance in which the system, as it is right now, this is
No.
tangential because we're talking about worker democracy, but like I
Well,
think this.
yeah, exactly.
I think
But
this speaks to a
yeah.
fundamental trust in institutions that liberals have that I don't. Like we're talking about the greatest apocalypse event that has ever definitely been projected to absolutely going to happen in all of human history. I mean, we're talking of global Mount Vesuvius, like a Pompeii to spread ash across the planet. And it's like, well, sure, Trump put like a coal lawyer on who wiped away 100 regulations. Trump wouldn't even acknowledge the existence of climate change. And now we have Biden, a guy who can't get through any legislation to fix anything because the Senate is half controlled by Republicans who are all buddy buddies with Murdoch and all of his fuckwit coal and oil friends who all have a material financial incentive. And all of these politicians just happen to own stock in the corporations who they benefit. This system is so obviously broken. Like there's such an obvious link between capital ownership and political corruption and doing things that fuck the planet. And I'm
Yep.
not saying that like worker ownership is going to necessarily fix all of these issues, but like we're looking at the most like decrepit system imaginable and pontificating whether or not like we want to give democracy a chance. Can you imagine if the founding fathers had done that? Like oh, like we clearly monarchies are bad, so like maybe we should do like kind of a half democracy. Oh, they did. They only let landowning white men vote, and they had slaves, and it took us 200 years to fix that. I don't want to take 200 years to realize that the problem can't be solved with half measures the way they did. Like that's fundamentally that's what you're talking about. There's always this hesitance to take that extra step. There are political and economic arguments. Maybe people don't want a full democracy because the average person isn't fully literate and it would assign to them responsibilities they can't handle. Maybe economically slavery is something a necessary evil, that's a phrase that came up a lot, that we need to contend with, right? But they were wrong. Democracy was always the solution, and it was sustainable then as it is now. We can't always kick the can down the road. And in this case, we're not talking about millions of slaves dying every year. That's bad enough. We're talking about billions of people dying soon. And that's just one outcome. I think the fact that collaboration between capital owners leading to the propagation of client science misinfo is all the evidence one would need to scrap capitalism. But like even in this shadow you find hope, and it's a faith in institutions that I just don't have. I can't I don't know. Any regulation you put forward in the EPA can be rolled back by the next Republican to win. The next time they put a coal lawyer, any education platform you want to put through, all it takes is the next private school Betsy DeVos billionaire appointed there to roll all of those back. As long as people whose material interests are different to the working class have the ability to seize political power, they will, and they'll keep doing it. And they can undo work much faster than we can build things up, because destroying is always easier than building.
Yeah, so this kind of does go into the next point. So I would just say that with regard to the whole environmental thing, my only reason for bringing up those types of those statistics, right, isn't to say that we're doing enough, right? It's really to say the opposite to a certain extent, and then to the broader point that you're making, it's to say that your broader point is necessarily not the best lens of analysis here. And I think that this is one of the fundamental problems I have with a lot of socialists, right? Which is that class interests enable and cause these things, right? These things exist because of these class interests, right? And I think that we wouldn't see any of the things that I just mentioned. We wouldn't see 60% of the way there by 2050 if that was like a broadly correct analysis. We'd see 0% of the way there by 2050 in general, right? My faith in the institutions that we have in society, the institution of sort of governing democracy, the institutions of you could say the EPA is an institution, the institution of just the government in general, is really based on a long history and an empirical backing of the idea that it tends to be the case that when people vote for a certain thing, that they or I'm sorry, apologies, when the median voter tends to want a certain thing, they tend to get that certain thing in some form or another. It's not a perfect system by any means, but I'm not the one saying that one system can solve all of these issues. You mentioned back before in the debate that there are capitalist countries with coal workers and oil workers that have these sort of material interests that don't have the same problem with misinformation with regard to climate change. Again, I agree. Capitalist countries can, in fact, deal with that type of information through education campaigns, through things like, perhaps regulations on certain topics, and
Who runs the
how you
regulation
might go about that.
industries? Who runs the schools?
Who?
In America,
Yes, I
cabinet
don't.
positions appointed by the president are the ones ultimately in charge, and they overwhelmingly choose people of the capital class to make those decisions. Even in those
Well,
social
again,
democracies, by the way, like
yeah. Go on.
Norway, their welfare systems have been getting gutted over the past few decades as well. Not autocracy, sorry, austerity and economic liberalization have been hammering away at the Nordic democracies for a time now. Not as severely as what we have, but you'll guess it, it's capital owners doing it. Who's defunding the NHS in the UK? Capital owners. Every time it's them. You build up a castle and watch them tear it down. Because in any country, 99% of the people here are going to be workers, and the most powerful people will be the remaining 1%, and they will be the ones eventually to sink their claws into the systems that we not only use to generate power, but to reaffirm it. It's not enough that they have government. All they have to do is buy one media company. Bezos bought the Washington Post. And the Washington Post has since published a number of things that are, let's say, optimistic about the nature of billionaires. Was Bezos telling them to do that? Probably not. But we can never know. There's no way of knowing. And that's scary. That is genuinely concerning. These institutions, at any time, and they're always the ones most likely to seize control of them because they have more power. If you're a billionaire, it's more likely you know these politicians, these other people, you can buy into them. Everything is up for sale. And the people capable of buying these systems just don't share the same interests as us. They don't have to.
Yeah, but I think that fundamentally what you're getting at in that point is, well, I suppose to go a little bit in order, I didn't write it down. I was looking something up. You mentioned that, you talk about Trump putting a coal lobbyist in the EPA or Betsy DeVos in the Department of Education. Again, there's an ebb and flow here. I would never say that there's not. I'm really talking about the broad story of America, and not just America, to be fair. I think it's easy for socialists perhaps to look at America and say that capitalism itself is the problem, when America is fairly unique in a lot of ways. But just to say that I think that narrative is broadly true over time. Now, you might say that, well, it's not fast enough, right? We're not reforming these issues quick enough. Look at climate change. That's the best example, perhaps, that you can come up with. And to be fair, it probably is the best example. But what I would say is that, again, I'm not sure you've properly responded to the idea that all of these material interests would still exist under a cooperatively run economy. All of the incentives exist, line for line. And you talk about, the last thing you mentioned that I'll respond to is the idea that, billionaires have an outsized influence. Look at that. Capitalism, right? Billionaires being able to buy news media companies. I agree that can be a problem, but the problem there isn't capital interest. It's not necessarily the capital class, because these sort of class distinctions would still exist under a worker cooperative system. It's just that everyone would be a worker. There'd still be differences in income and wealth. These are the things that really, I think, are potential precarious, they inject precariousness into some of these institutions. I agree. Income inequality is a problem, but taxes, government oversight, democratic government in general has shown to very effectively address income inequality and wealth inequality through taxation and through these sort of reform and welfare policies. You talk about welfare programs being cut in the Nordic countries. Some welfare programs have been cut some of the time, but the broad trend over time is that social spending is going up. We don't see these institutions fundamentally eroding over time, and it is because of last sentence, it's because of that democratic accountability that we agree with. I just think that government democratic accountability is good enough, and I think that democratic accountability in the workplace is good, but I think that complete ubiquitous worker democracy is not actually good. I think that rather we can have a give and take here between capital and workers that is valuable, and I think that a completely democratic government has shown to be fairly robust. That's definitely longer than one sentence, I'm sorry, but has shown a robust ability to address these social ills over time.
We will only take, and we will not give. First of all, these social democracies are being eroded. And this give and take that you refer to is an interplay between increasing systemic inequality and general technological advancement. American wealth inequality has been increasing for a century, since the New Deal. This is not a slowly increasing thing. Things have been getting worse. For 100 years, they've been getting worse. And they will continue to get worse as long as we live in countries where capital owners are capable of making these political decisions. It was capital owners who lobbied, capital owners who wrote those bills, capital owners who brought them to the heads of the parties, capital owners that sat them down, capital owners that voted on them, capital owners that promoted everything, always. And the vast majority of the population is the one that suffers the outcomes of these events. Every time. We talk like things are always getting better. Like how? The issue is you want a monarchy. You want to make life better for the serfs without getting rid of the king. You say, well, we don't really have an issue with the king necessarily. We can find ways to have social democracy. We can find ways to have, high like rates of, education and literacy and such. But the problem with monarchs is that they don't let you do that. It's not enough to pontificate. I think if anything, your system is the idealist one. Like mine is the realistic one. You're talking about building a dam while the river continues to flow. I'm talking about stopping the river. You're talking about building a system antithetical to the interests of the capital class while the capital class are still in charge of everything. And I'm saying we don't need them. We can build alternative systems. I have responded to these points. What the differences are in material interest. Transparency makes a critical distinction, as does internal accountability, how likely a whistleblower is to be fired, how much you can speak out without being quietly shunned from the industry. And additionally, you'd be advocating only for the interests of your business, not for the capital class as a broader institution, which they consistently do, which is why you see, of course, members of the capital class always act in tandem. I say always here, of course, I'm exaggerating, but they overwhelmingly do. They have class interests. They're class conscious. They know what they're doing. They know what they want. They know what their interests are. They disagree sometimes in cultural issues, but like if you take a look at like the ultra wealthy in this country, you will not see a representative split of different political like beliefs. You're not going to see the same like 30-40-30 red independent blue split that you would get down the line for the average working person. You're not going to see the same split on tax issues or on landowning issues or in anything related to workers or regulation or anything like that. There is clearly a distinction. That is true. There are countries that are capitalist that don't have all the problems that we have here in America, but they have some of them. And other countries that aren't America have problems that we don't have. And it's always the same group responsible. Just because all problems aren't present everywhere doesn't mean there isn't a shared cause. We can fix it, but we have to work in the absence of the uber powerful group of people who want the opposite of what the average citizen wants. We need to get rid of the ability to grow powerful through ownership.
Yeah. So, I think that, when I say you haven't responded, I mean, you said things that were countering what I'm saying. Obviously that's true. I'm just saying that I'm not sure we've fully connected the two. The idea that being able to buy ownership in a company causes all of these problems. The idea that there wouldn't be the same sort of similar class distinction. Obviously, if we're talking in a sort of socialist or maybe Marxian sense, the strict definition of bourgeois versus worker, there would not be that distinction. But again, there would still be these wealth distinctions. You talk about worker cooperatives as a means to perhaps alleviate some of this inequality. I think that worker cooperatives have been shown to alleviate some amount of firm level inequality. 15, 25% of it maybe, but we're not talking about this huge amount, this incredible reduction of inequality because of the cooperative organization.
Hold on.
And I would just say,
15 to 20%. How? Because the difference between average pay of a worker and a CEO in a co-op is fractionally smaller than the difference in the average pay of a traditional worker and traditional CEO.
Yeah, the analysis that I saw was comparing, apologies. The analysis that I saw was comparing like to like, right? It was comparing similar cooperatives to similar traditionally managed firms. Now, obviously, if you don't want to talk empirics, that's fine, but it's going to be pretty difficult for you to. We would have to just imagine the empirics because there's not been like a broad amount of. I suppose there's not been a broad amount of, large cooperatives that have been adopted literally anywhere, even in the most sort of cooperatively dense regions in the world. But in general, what they've shown is that there's still a relative amount of inequality within those types of systems. Now, and that's my only point really with regard to a lot of the points that you just made is that I agree that there's precariousness with income inequality. Income inequality has a lot of extrapolations from it that are negative for society. My only point would be that taxes finance and democratic government have shown an ability to tackle that issue. One of the books that I read, I might be interpreting this graph wrong to be fair, has shown that income inequality based on several indices has actually been flat over time. And between a country inequality, right, the relative sort of inequality between country A and B has actually been decreasing since 1990, right? And so, those are valuable statistics because I think what it shows is that, you might say that inequality in country A or B might be going up or down, but I'm talking about the broadest possible trend, the broadest samplings that we have. It's been relatively static or decreasing over time, talking about in-country versus out-of-country inequality. And I think that every study that I've looked at has shown that taxes are a valuable way to address that inequality. And they don't, well, you might say that they're motivated and why they don't recommend this. They don't typically recommend worker cooperatives as a means to solve that issue because taxes have a more aggregative effect. They're more efficient probably than implementing this type of structure. They're more redistributive in nature. And honestly, they probably just straight up lead to more directly less inequality than worker cooperatives because there's still not a distinction between non-workers and workers at cooperative A versus B. If you get a flat benefit, you get a flat benefit. If you're taxed, you're taxed, right? And you might argue for those same systems. I'm just saying that those systems seem to effectively address the problems that you're talking about. Whereas I'm not sure, obviously you cannot demonstrate that worker cooperatives would solve these issues. We can only sort of speculate, but I give you that's probably an advantage in my favor, not in yours, but that's not because I've done any extra work in that regard. That's just how it is. But in general, though, I just don't think that I don't think you've presented to me a convincing reason why these problems empirically haven't been able to be solved or in the future could not be solved under a democratic, but also a democratic government framework with a capitalist economic framework, especially when, again, I feel like we also haven't gotten an adequate response to the idea that the transparency benefits, which seems to be a lot of the things that you're sort of hinging on, these sorts of benefits, the worker, worker board membership, unionization, that why we couldn't solve those types of issues with worker board membership and unionization. You keep talking about class interest and the interest itself, but I'm breaking down that class interest, I think similarly to you are. I'm just trying to use tools that have been proven to be effective, not ones that necessarily haven't been proven to be effective on an aggregate level. I think a mandate is where you end up running into all of these problems.
So a few things. First of all,
go for it.
Income inequality is at very high levels. Global income inequality might have decreased because the aggregate is averaging out. Industrialization in developing countries is bringing them up a little bit more to par in a sort of relativistic way. In terms of like relative wealth inequality in this country, it is historically high. I know there's some variable fluctuation there, but you're talking about it. It's like basically the worst like in human history.
No, but let me jump in.
But some of the stuff that you said is just, like, isn't true. You saying that there's a 15 to 20% decrease in inequality from like firms to like firms. The average ratio of pay from a worker to a CEO in America is 1 to 400 or so. Co-ops have nowhere near that. They're not 15% lower, which I think would be, 345 or something? Something. They're not 20% lower, which would be like 320 to 1. They're massively lower. I don't know what metric would be used for that, but obviously whatever kind of worker cooperative I would advocate for would have a fairly flat income level. Also, nothing I'm talking about here is in any way antithetical to a good tax policy. They're completely compatible with each other. The issue is, like, you're asking me, why can't my systems work? I ask you, why haven't they been implemented? I acknowledge the reason why my big mandate hasn't happened yet is because it's against the interests of the most powerful people on earth. We must force them to do it. However necessary, we must force them to. But what you're suggesting is that within the system, through incentive and through, management, like we should advocate for this, worker controls half, higher tax rates. Well, then why isn't that happening? Every country on earth in the West right now, developing capitalist countries, developed capitalist countries, where is this tremendous social democracy then? We had some of them because there was a post-war boom, and we saw when manufacturing was done locally, and usually, of course, you have countries that have disproportionately a good welfare states. There's usually some kind of internal economic supplement. Norway has their oil, of course, the social wealth fund. Sweden has been gutted over the past 40 years. The UK was never that good to begin with, and now capital interests are selling off bits of the NHS. I'm pointing to a system, a series of problems, and you're asking me where the evidence is that they're causing the problem. The capital owners are as inseparable from the problems of today as the monarchs of the 14th century European kingdoms were. You cannot remove them. You cannot give them half power. The Magna Carta did not end monarchy, and keeping slavery in a democracy does not fundamentally address the necessary cobalance between economic needs and the right to people's ownership of the systems they live within. You have to cut the problem off at the head, metaphorically. With this, we metaphorically in a video game, we talk about
In a
these
video
systems, right? Of course, but like we live in a ludicrously inequitable system, climate disaster, which is undeniably caused by the behavior of either the capital class or those directly linked to it. Is barreling down at us. I just don't understand it. Like, here are the counter arguments to me, right? We might
Yep.
have some difficulty acquiring capital invest or like proper investment structures when you have this big cooperative mandate. Like, that's it, you know? Worker cooperatives are quite effective in some respects and neutral in many others. We don't seem to have a lot of information suggesting they're like distinctly worse in fields, which is why I advocate for more testing research. We have to get more data. We and my arguments against you here are that every problem that we suffer right now is directly tied to one particular group of people. And the reason they're able to propagate these issues is a direct product of the nature of the class relationship between them and working people. There is a huge difference between an owner of a corporation and a person who is a worker who is elected to its top. There is an incredible difference between those two things. And we know that because we know there's a difference between an authoritarian and a democratic government. There are corporations that have more employees right now than some small city-states did back in, the Middle Ages. And we can see perfectly well then that there were consequences to autocratic management. I don't see how these transpose. It's a kind of economic conservatism. The belief that, oh, democracy was a fine experiment then, but, well, now we're done with it. I don't see why we should be done with it, especially when the arguments against my position are essentially capital acquisition might be difficult. We can work on ways to handle that. I still think that non-controlling shares would be a fine solution if you just got rid of the stock market. We've done it before. It's not like we couldn't do it again. And on your side, it's like, well, the EPA is doing fine. We'll invent new technology to fix climate change. Like, every developed country on earth could have had like a good like social welfare system this whole time, but for some reason they don't have it. It has nothing to do with the capital class running the media and running the government. Like, you understand, this isn't a product of conspiracy. These people wear it on their chests. You vote for a politician, you know perfectly well which corporations they used to work on the board of. You know perfectly well who they're friends with because we have transparency. It's a democratic country. We wouldn't know if it was some fully authoritarian shithole. Another benefit there, I think. It's not conspiracism. We've gotten rid of political classes before. We eliminated the monarchy. I think this is a realistic approach. We must block off the water before we can build the dam.
Yeah. So yeah, to respond to a little bit of these points, I think we get into well, yeah, just go into it basically. So you talk about why hasn't your system been implemented? Where is this sort of worker, social democracy, worker democracy that I'm talking about? Almost every country in Europe has worker board membership, sectoral bargaining, relatively robust workers' rights and representation with regard to disputes between them and capital owners, and not to mention, like I said, a seat at the table if they have worker board membership and unionization. So I mean, again, you mentioned previously in this debate that not all countries have the problem with climate denial as an example. You mentioned not all countries have the same problems everywhere, but that doesn't mean there isn't sort of a broad apparatus of issues. Well, I do think it's sort of it's weird because I feel like it's almost like you're using the holes in the narrative to prove the narrative itself, right? That doesn't mean that there's necessarily not a broad sort of apparatus of issues in this regard. I think it actually does disprove that. I think what it proves is that a capitalist system under a regulatory framework that's democratically decided, in fact, does have a heck of an ability to determine the flows of society and where we move. I think you get into a straw man. Well, exactly. That's what I was about to mention. I think you get into a straw man of my argument when you talk about how, action's not really required. The environmental policy's fine, right? The EPA is great. These welfare programs are doing just fine. Unequal exchange, whatever. We'll reform out of it. Why don't they have their welfare? They'll get it eventually. I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying we actually do need a fair amount of policy to address these things. What I'm defending is the idea that policy itself.
Why would that policy get passed?
So I would argue that policy would get passed. Well, when you say that policy, there's a broad set of things I just mentioned. Those policies, I think, in general, would get passed if people generally would support them and vote for representatives to do so. I think that I've adequately responded to the idea that people are just simply almost like cogs in a machine, just manufactured consent all the way to the moon. Again, we wouldn't see. Well, just one second.
Why is union participation died off here in America? Well, I can't. But what you're saying is demonstrably wrong. Like,
it's not.
No, it is. Like, what people know about these complicated economic issues is going to be supplied to them from powerful institutions. Unions objectively made people's lives better here in the States, and now union membership is at record lows. Clearly, there's not a correlation, at least not a strong one, between... Actually, I will say this. There is a correlation between what voters want and what gets voted in, but there doesn't seem to be a correlation always between what's good for voters and what gets voted in. Because people want the right to work, right? I mean, people want a lot of things that end up being pretty bad for them, right? Because all the media promotes it. They say it's fine. The Republicans come out there and they say, Democrats are doing socialism by doing infrastructure bills, Like, in this environment, entirely fueled by capital interests, like clearly it's not. Like, Europe sucks. They're like marginally better. They have cooler buildings, I guess. Like, is that the win? Like, they're barely any better than we are. They're like 10 years down the line from where we are, I guess. Maybe.
I really disagree. But hold on. No, I really disagree with a lot of the premises stated here. So I think that with regard to union membership, right, in the United States, I think we peaked out about 30-40%. I don't think it was 30%. I think it was around 30% unionization back in the 70s. Was about where the United States peaked out. Now we're about down to 10%. I'm not sure. And to be fair, like, obviously I hear you maybe Googling it. Google it. I think that is the correct answer. And to be fair, that is a decrease, right? Going from 30% to 10%. Now we've got about half of people represented by public unions, and private unions have sort of gone away. That is a problem, but I'm not sure that's a problem that necessarily is borne out in every single country. In a lot of countries, union membership has declined, but for instance, in Europe, they don't have right to work laws in Europe, right? They have basically the equivalent of right to work laws in Europe, right? From what I was able to do, and I'm happy to be corrected on that. That's just what I was able to read, was that there's a similar sort of ability to not actually do basically be a part of a union but work at a company in European countries as there is in many GOP-run states today. It's not to say that right to work is good. It's just to say that the propensity for an economy to really broadly adopt unionization is probably less dependent on the relationship fundamentally between capital owners and workers. And it's probably more so based on how stringent government policy is, how transparent the democratic structure of their government is, and how, frankly, just
policy.
So as I've said throughout this entire time, I think that really quick, the last thing that I was going to respond to, and I'll respond to that after this, is that I don't think we could say that I don't think we could say that the people of the Nordic economies or like Western Europe face a marginally better circumstance than the United States. There is a heck of a difference between the workers of America and the workers of those countries, what they face and what we face. I think there is a big difference there. Now, with regard to your question, who sort of determines how that policy gets passed? Initially the voters do, right? I think that, again, there is evidence that pretty much the median voters' wishes are often represented, or pretty much always represented, in government. There's actually a specific analysis released that analyzed voter preferences with regard to welfare spending specifically, almost like the exact question that we're talking about. And what it showed was that in the short run, political parties and like party interests can have some effects, right? Similar to what we're both saying here, that sometimes you might see welfare spending decrease. You might see the NHS get cut. You might see social assistance be scaled back, right? So whatever it might be. You might see Social Security get scaled back, right? But what it also found was that over the long run, voter preferences essentially entirely dictated welfare spending in the country. And I don't think that I don't think, one, it's been demonstrated that this manufacturing consent issue is broadly true. The narrative makes sense, but I think that there's a lot of dynamics at play that are hard to account for. And then I don't think we can say that just because we don't have capital owners, all of these same incentives that Chomsky would talk about wouldn't necessarily exist. Now, I don't want to speak for Chomsky. Frankly, he'd probably obviously disagree with me. I'm not sure what he would say in this regard, but all of those things, we went line by line on manufacturing consent. Every single one of those things would still apply to a market socialist system. And the transparency gains of, of cooperative ownership would still exist with
Okay.
worker board members. Worker board members would have all of the same rights to company information and management processes as any other member of the board. So I think that there's a lot of holes in this narrative, and I don't think that we can say definitively that capital owners need to be excised from the system. You're right. Now, the last thing I was going to say, I keep saying that,
You do
is
keep
that
saying
you're right.
that, yeah.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I swear to God, just cut me off in 2 sentences. Okay. You're right that, fuck, I forgot. Go on. Go for it. I forgot what I was going to say.
Okay, there's no holes in the narrative at all. Unions make life better for workers. Business owners lie about unions destroying their businesses, as they have complained about every kind of regulation and countermeasure against businesses for hundreds of years. They go to the news stations, those narratives are promoted, people vote in people with austere or opposite economic interests. The common strategy right now, actually, is don't directly address the economic issues, but shoot any of them down by saying that they're woke, tie them to cultural issues. Who was it, Josh Hawley, who said that Biden's Build Back Better plan was too woke because it would address climate change, and climate change is for pink-haired social justice warriors? Like, and you know, if you take a look at who Josh Hawley is buddies with and how much money he's got, every time, man, listen, Europe is not that much better off than we are. They get like healthcare. They're a capitalist country. They're capitalist countries. The welfare state has been dismantled in Sweden and in the process of dismantling. Denmark is not that good for poor people, though they have expanded benefits for their shrinking middle class. The UK was never that great, and the NHS has been torn up. And there is a direct relationship between austerity politics and the voters' interests. You see this with the Blairites back when they were doing their Labour run in the UK. They talk about the need to tighten our belts, and people start voting as though money isn't something the government can literally print. And then all of a sudden you have all these welfare programs cut. The Grenfell Tower, burnt because what was it? Thatcher deregulated the system by which these buildings were like overseen, and then you had them cheaping out on like the insulation material, and then it all caught fire or whatever. Like there are direct consequences, immediate consequences to this promotion. And what I'm talking about right now is not like some crazy big brain socialist like idealist take or whatever. This is like very straightforward application of basic like not even theory, just like what the media does. The media promotes interests that are beneficial to the media. The people in charge of the media have a disproportionate weight on what they consider their interests to be. They're overwhelmingly wealthy capital owners. So if they're buddies with other wealthy capital owners, they form collaborative narratives that end up benefiting them. If you take a look at like news media over the past century, you will find a litany of misinformation promoted by business interests. Not just for the individual business, though. For all businesses, a constant attack on labor and labor rights, on regulation, on workplace enforcement, on the ability for workers to regulate or to manage or to whistleblow. Constant. And if there was true democracy, if these, the news was news and people were voting in favor of their own interests, we would have like 98% union representation right now. Hyperbolic, but I'll go with it. All these issues, like if people really voted for what they wanted and what they wanted was really good for them, we would have socialized healthcare, empirically better than what we have here in the States. We would have full union participation. We would have like a litany of workers' right laws that we don't have. But the history of workers' rights in this country is a history of blood. Everything from banning child labor to establishing a 5-day work week to overtime is something people fought for, and they fought against people. They fought against business owners who sent the government in Pinkertons. They fought against planes that bombed their mining camps. The idea that this class antagonism went from literal bloodshed to, oh, it's just a trade relationship, Oh, but we both have opposite interests and we negotiate to find what's mutually beneficial is ridiculous, and it's naive. That is not what happened. Things got less explicitly violent in the States. We kill plenty of people abroad, Coca-Cola death squads, Colombia, etc., etc. The fundamental relationship has maintained its severity. It's just gotten quieter. And we can't pretend that's not the case. It's always them. It's always the capital owners. I feel I've addressed the how would things be different under a cooperative thing. If you disagree, that's fine. I'm working from a position right now where I feel like there's a very strong historical incentive to do away with this class, as we did away with the monarchy. And the obstacle that I have to overcome is, let's sort out the investment thing, you know. And I feel like that's a pretty easy hurdle to get over. Cooperatives still preserve the fundamental productivity of the enterprise. All the money still exists. The money hasn't gone anywhere, you know. People can loan money as banks or credit unions if they want. Or if they want to do a proper investment, there are non-controlling shares. You can put in so and so much money and hope that it ends up being worth more in the long run. These systems work, you know? And maybe right now those aren't attractive, because why invest in a non-controlling share when controlling shares are the norm? But, you know, why hire regular workers when you can hire undocumented people you pay 1/3 under the table? Why hire like a white man when you can hire a slave to work your plantation, you know? Why have, like, you know, paid freemen when you can use serfs? Like, that's always the question, isn't it? It's always going to be more efficient to exploit. But we fix that by killing the people who exploit. Full stop.
Metaphorically.
Metaphorically.
Yes, in a video game. Yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I think, again, I think that what you haven't responded to in this regard is is the empirical argument, right? I think that this is where the narrative really starts to deconstruct itself, right? You talk about, and again, I do say the narrative makes sense, right? It's just the empirics that tend to kick the narrative out of being factual, right? So, for instance, you talk about the NHS being cut, sort of, vaguely the NHS is being cut. Not that it's not. You haven't referenced anything specific. You talk about the same thing in Sweden. Again, broadly, these societies have increased social welfare over time, right? You haven't
How
responded
so?
to the idea that there's how so? Well, I mean, a lot of it is increased retirement spending for elderly people. A lot of it is increased healthcare spending as well. A lot of it's an expansion of unemployment benefits, right? What have you. It's also hard because some societies, like, you might look at
As a
like the Netherlands
percentage?
or
Recently?
as a well, again, you're putting so many caveats. So
You
as a percentage of
chastise
GDP,
me.
the answer
You
is
chastise me for being vague, but that's important. If we go back a
no,
hundred
no, no.
years, then yes, the welfare state's expanded since then. But I mean,
Well,
given
I just gave several examples though. I mean, and I also when I
since
say
the
caveats, what I
80s,
mean is like,
like the 80s was when like
well,
the whole
yes,
neoliberal, like austerity, deregulate, cut thing really kicked
yeah.
into shape. So I'm just making sure we're operating at a proper time frame here. I know Sweden's has significant, cuts.
Yeah.
I know the NHS has. I know Denmark's had some weird shifts.
Yeah, since the answer is yes. Since the 80s, as a proportion of our economy, we tend to distribute more in terms of taxation, and also spend more in terms of social spending. And when I say putting caveats, you talk about recently. It depends on your window, obviously. Recently, obviously, we've spent a shitload more money on social welfare because of COVID. I'm not sure if you'd give me the credit in that regard, but that is broadly true. It's absolutely true that we've spent a lot more on social welfare. The most recently that we can look at. And again, you might have a socialist analysis for why we would do that. I'm not really sure. In general, though,
It
I would
doesn't
just
expand
agree that
worker
some of
power.
these. Well, I think that it does, though, right? Because if you have a generous welfare state to fall back on, and your boss is treating you like shit, you absolutely have the ability to say, no, frictionally, I'm going to unemploy myself so that I can get on this welfare, get another job, right? It's the same reason why people would say that a UBI would increase the negotiating power of workers, because they have more of an income
But they
backdrop to
only did it
negotiate
to
with
keep these
their workers
businesses
back.
afloat. I mean, we had the PPP loans, of course, but also the main reason why like a bunch of these COVID like supplementary like welfare things took place um, was simply because it's necessary for maintaining basic economic functionality. That's what we're talking about right now. The CDC
No, no,
cut
no, no,
the
no. I know, and I
yeah,
don't want to get into
it's
because
in,
again with
but
COVID,
that so
I
that's not
agreed.
that's not
You
worker
probably wouldn't give
power.
me credit.
Yeah, it
No,
doesn't
no.
give us more
Again,
powerful over
I
of the world.
I said I agree. You probably wouldn't give me credit on all the social welfare spending related to COVID, right? That's why I'm just saying that if it depends on your time frame. If you're talking 80s, 90s, the answer is yes. We spend as a proportion of our economy more on social welfare since then. And when I say we, I mean in aggregate. Again, you can probably look at specific countries that have made reforms that spend less. But then I would probably just appeal to perhaps quality of life. We can take a more contextual analysis if you want, but we're having a broader discussion. So I'm not sure it makes sense to look at specific countries when we're having a broader discussion about the entire mode and means of production of our society, right? I don't think it makes sense at that point to say, look at the UK cutting their welfare spending, right? That's an example, or cutting their NHS spending, right? That's a reason why we need to get rid of capital interest. Those are decent enough examples, but I don't think that they're good enough to overcome the broad empirical truth that social spending has indeed increased. The last thing you talked about is
just one
yeah,
thing.
go on.
Keep in mind, social spending isn't the goal for me. It's worker control. Even a system in which you had a
Yeah.
perfect welfare state, which was you could like I said, you could have a country which is a monarchy with no democracy, where you have a perfect welfare state, and I would still hate that country. Democracy is non-negotiable. You can have a welfare
Well,
state
but
that
you,
doesn't confer control to the working class. Sometimes it can placate them. That's kind of a common like
yeah.
cyberpunk theme.
Well, but you said earlier in the debate, though, that you actually didn't believe that, right? As far as I understood, what you said earlier in the debate was that if it could be proven that this society would be so materially worse off, you actually wouldn't. You'd probably shift your beliefs at that point. Is that not true, or is that true?
Like society collapsing. How, out of curiosity, how bad, how non-functioning would democracy have to be for you to want to live under like a, like a Kazakhstan or like a Saudi Arabian type government? Like, how much better would they, like, if, for
Hmm.
instance, if they could provide like a greater proportion of their national budget towards welfare stuff in accordance with
Yeah.
a greater efficiency conferred through
Hmm.
authoritarianism, and they also had a more robust economy, would you prefer that?
No, I wouldn't because I do fundamentally value democracy and civic society, right? The reason I asked you the question is because it seems like you're making contradictory statements where you're saying, on one hand, you're saying, I don't give a shit how perfect a society is without democracy. I would still want democracy. But then in the beginning of the debate, you said, I actually very much give a shit how like materially wealthy society is. So I might not actually be in favor of worker democracy if it could be proven that it was so bad.
If
So
it's an
these statements
enormous
seem to be
distinction, but there's no
totally
evidence that there.
contradictory.
Well, I said if there's an enormous distinction, just that it's not my focus.
Yeah.
Right now, there's no evidence of any distinction because worker cooperatives either outperform traditional firms, or in a lot of cases, they simply
Yeah.
perform like neutrally. It's like
No,
very
no, I get
variable.
that. And I would appeal to the empirical argument as well. But I'm saying you didn't make empirical arguments on either end of the debate. You said principally, I do believe in democracy. I don't care how like materially well off a monarchist system is. But then at the beginning you said principally, I believe in democracy, but only up to a certain point. And these things don't seem to. Can you explain the distinction, or do you want to amend one of the statements?
I mean, if you had like if there was a system or a set of material conditions where you could have democracy, but it would mean everyone's like, killing dogs for scrap to eat in like
Sure.
in like
Yeah.
junkyards or whatever. Like, I guess like a strong man who could make everything right might be an appealing like idea right then. But I don't think that's the divide we're dealing with. I'm only saying that there's a difference between worker control, which is what I care about, and I think that will necessarily ferment benefits. Like the system I'm advocating for right now is capable of doing everything you're advocating for. And I don't think there are any downsides to the implementation of my system over yours. And we get to get rid of the bourgeois in my system. Because everything you say we could do with half board membership or, whatever parcel, half measure or whatever, you could certainly do under my system because I'd be far more aggressive about it. But you can also fix
Mhm.
problems that you couldn't, problems I'm ascribing to the bourgeois as a class, which I imagine categorically you're going to disagree with due to a different ideological framework. But I think that looking at
Yep.
history and looking at the world today, there is extremely strong evidence that the history of the world is a history of class struggle. And that the easiest and best way to resolve the antagonisms brought about by that conflict is to make sure there is only one class, the working class. And that should be the only controlling group of any country, a proletarian state.
Mhm. Well, I think that outside of what I would say, the last thing that I would say, and perhaps it's a good stopping point for the debate because we might be going in circles at this point,
Maybe a
would be
bit.
to say that yeah, no, it's fine. I've enjoyed the conversation. the last thing that I would say in this regard is that I would actually say the exact same thing about your system, right? Is that, all the benefits conferred by your system, I think would be solved in my system. I think that if you actually appeal to the historical, analysis and argument, I think that what we do see is that there is oftentimes conflict between capital owners and workers. However, there's oftentimes conflict with regard to trade. I think that this is an example that kind of underpins the way that I view the relationship between capital and owners. It's a trade, right? Workers are trading part of their surplus labor value for ease of access to capital for a higher wage than they'd probably otherwise be able to garner if they did it on their own, if they started their own business. It is a trade. Now, that's not to say that trade can't be coercive. Of course, trade can be coercive, right? If the United States says, hey, Bermuda, I'm going to nuclear bomb your island unless you give me all of your money, right? That's obviously a coercive relationship, but that's where rules are in place to try and prevent that type of incredible coercion from happening in the first place. I think coercion fundamentally is some sort of a problem with trade relationships and with the relationship oftentimes between workers and employees. There can be coercion, there can be monopsony power, there can be market failures there. But I think that what's been proven over time is that not only are typically institutions strengthening over time, they're strengthening because of the democratic say that individual people have in their governments. Governments have proven an ability to regulate these types of things, right? I think that if broadly it was true, your narrative. On one hand, we've got this powerful capitalist class that's able to basically manufacture consent, control the governed, control the government. On one hand, this is true, but then on the other hand, we've got all of these systems not only being funded more than they were otherwise, not only having more redistribution, oftentimes higher tax burdens over time, because not only has social spending gone up, so has taxes as a percent of GDP, right? So why would the capitalist class allow this massive redistribution of wealth not only to happen, but to increase over time? And I think that if you appeal to history, that is what you get. And that's why I advocate for my system. I feel like your system has the downsides that I mentioned of this sort of structural finance problem, economic growth, probably economic mobility as well. But my system has a lot of the same, if not all the same benefits of yours. That would be, that's kind of what I would say to close it out.
Well, the nice thing about both of our systems is that it's probably going to be a while before we find divergent paths, right?
Yeah, I think that ultimately that is something that the market socialists and the social democrats of the world can certainly agree on, is that we might probably fundamentally be on the same road, right? It's just that I might be done after after a 10K, whereas you might want to run the full marathon, right?
Not with this body.
We.
But yeah, that's the goal.
Oh, well,
we've got a
that's
lot of
fair.
work to do with getting evidence on the implementation of this stuff. I would like to see more instances of sort of incremental worker ownership applied to get more data from it. But ideologically, there is an irreconcilable difference. Maybe time will change people's perspectives on this. I guess we'll see.
Okay. And I've got some closing questions for you.
Hit me.
Okay. When are you going to go on the well-known and popular and not infamous but extraordinary podcast known as Alcoholics, hosted by Kaio-san and Spectre?
I've been on a podcasting bent lately. Let me see. Alcoholics. Is that a second O or a second I? Oh, I see. Second I. Okay, let's see. Terrain and cream mixed. I think I'd be really bad at this because I've gotten drunk like maybe 3 times in the past year. I feel like I'd have to do some studying.
Yeah, drinking is not a strict requirement, and I'm not part of the show. They just they were sure to ask, ask Vosh to come on our show.
If they email me, I love popping on people's podcasts. Usually I just do it on my days off, like because they record locally. Yeah.
All right, you heard it there, Kaio and Spectre. Just email Vosh. To be fair, that's how I got to debate Vosh a couple times. And the second question that I had is, can I tell the people to subscribe to me?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. I've actually seen a couple of your debates on the aforementioned off days.
Yeah, well, that's you heard it there, folks. Vosh, #1 econoboi fan, watching watching my debates offline. That is actually, that does mean a lot, because I'm sure that you don't, similar to like other content creators, like, I'm sure you probably don't watch a lot of streams or content yourself necessarily. So that does actually mean something. So if anyone's interested, I am a filthy social democrat and a capitalist, but like Vosh said, we do agree fundamentally on many policies. So if you're interested in a policy analysis, that I do, I debate conservatives, I debate socialists, and I do a lot of sort of, just generic sort of economic discussions. I'm actually doing a video on social wealth funds, which most capitalists and socialists can oftentimes end up liking. And that video is probably going to be about 15 or 20 minutes long or something like that, just talking about what social wealth funds are. That's an example of the type of informative content that I
Soaked
do.
on
So
Left keeps telling me to learn about social wealth funds, and every time I look at the page that he linked me like a year ago, my eyes glaze over. So maybe that'd be a good way for me to learn as well.
you don't, I guess you're not as interested in social wealth funds. Is that it?
It's not as bloody. No, it doesn't confer the kind of worker control I get hard over. But no, it does look
Well,
good. It does look good. Yeah, I'm being contention. I'm being antagonistic right now. Yes, they do look nice.
well, I don't know. I mean, could I ask you about that though?
About what I get hard over, or about social
Well, not
welfare funds.
no, about yeah, about, well, really about Norway
Mhm.
specifically, because I actually think you could. I'm not a socialist, to be fair, but I think you could actually make. So let me caveat this. If your requirement of socialism is that there cannot be any capital ownership, Norway does not qualify as a socialist country. However, if you view socialism as more of a spectrum, like many do, right, where you can either be more socialist or more capitalist or in between, somewhere in there, I think there's actually a very strong argument that Norway is functionally a socialist economy in many respects. Can I give you a few of those respects and see what your reaction is?
Go for it.
Okay, so number one, 40% of the GDP is collected and distributed in the form of taxation under a democratic framework. So that's nearly half the economy right there. In 2020, government spending as a percent of the GDP was a majority of the economy. Around 60% of country wealth is collectivized with the social wealth fund. If you don't include household wealth, like house wealth, that goes up to 76%. This is in addition to around 30% of the Oslo stock market is actually owned by the government, either in the form of state-owned enterprises or their domestic social wealth fund. And a majority of people are represented by unions. 2/3 of employees are covered by collective bargaining agreements. I mean, that sounds like a fairly collectivized economy to me.
It sounds nice, but there are still two economic classes, right? It's one of those supplemental things where I guess in terms of socialism for me, it's people talk about socialism like it's an economic ideology, but the more I think about it, the more I feel like that might be misplaced. It's a political ideology with economic prerequisites. And I feel like at the end of the day, as long as capital ownership persists, the fundamental power differential between the two classes will be maintained. Though, of course, the social welfare is an admirable goal. America sucks quite a bit more than those countries because we have less of it in that respect, at least. I think there's some stuff to learn there. If nothing else, the systems by which you could maintain a strong social welfare system would still be necessary in a uh, you know, uh,
Mhm.
um, market socialism, right? I mean, you'd still have to, you
Yep.
you would yeah, you would still have to know how to properly distribute that wealth and tax and what have you. So, yeah.
What if every company was owned by a social wealth fund? So the idea would be that capital is ultimately owned by the government, but operationally businesses are private. Would this be a socialist system?
Um, I don't think so because of the power those groups could leverage. Even if they're owned monetarily by the government, if you're not democratically electing people within those corporations, the person at the top still has leverage they can use to beckon government benefits. They wouldn't be a bourgeois
Mhm.
in the Marxian sense, but if you have control over like Norwegian oil company, even, and it's not a democratically elected fashion. You could go to the government, appropriately leverage your wealth and power to procure benefits for yourself. Whereas if it's a democratically elected system, you could still do so, not as an owner, but as a democratically elected representative. But you would do so alone, singly, as a representative of your own
Hmm.
institution, rather than as a member of a controlling, undemocratically, managed firm. Sorry, I'm rambling
So
really hard because I got like no sleep. I apologize. My brain is faltering somewhat.
so it's not enough to democratize capital or the government. It really is. You have, under your system, you have to democratize the individual workplaces as a prerequisite for your system to be considered socialist.
I don't think anyone should be able to have any kind of meaningful power without them being able to be voted out if people underneath them get angry.
Right. Well, yeah. That sounds like you agree with what I said. That makes
I agree. I agree with
sense.
the statement that you just levied. Yes, I feel the democracy is a necessary characteristic. Because I can imagine, for example, in noted economic text 1984. Technically the firms people work out there aren't privately owned by anyone, right? I mean, there are a great many. They wouldn't call them businesses, I suppose. The institutions that they work at, for the middle party, or what's it called? The lower party was the lesser party, the whatever Winston worked for. Anyway, nobody owns it, of course, but people are still in charge of those systems, and you can maintain, in the worst scenario, a kind of bourgeois, by implication, which is what the Soviet Union had, right? Technically, nobody owned those factories, but party members managed them, and the only people who can vote in party members for that management position are other party members. So, you know,
Hmm.
it might as well be a shareholder board.
Are you still an anarchist,
I'd
or
like to,
or have you kind of?
I'd like to think I am. The term just gets people angry at me, though, so I usually just go by libertarian
Oh.
socialist.
Okay, I got you. No, I was. You haven't talked about that in a while, and I've been campaigning to try and get a talk with Zoe Baker. Not necessarily a debate, but I think I'd really just. She seems like quite a well-read anarchist, whereas a lot of anarchists seem to. It's kind of that anarchism is when there's no bedtime kind of thing, and I think
Yeah.
that
Zoe
it's probably
Baker
not.
is remarkably
Yeah, go
well
on.
read. I was just saying, yeah, Zoe Baker's remarkably well read. Certainly smarter than I am. I would watch any conversation that you had with her.
Yeah, I'd love to make it happen. She's just recently finished a PhD, so I can't blame her if she's just wants to wind down a little bit. Obviously, that's quite a
Yeah.
difficult thing to do.
It's been a busy
But
few months, I'm
uh,
sure.
yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure. Well, all right. I mean, all right, Vosh. It was good talking to you. I don't have anything else. Like I said, I think we agree on many, most every prescription besides the most, so you could say aggressive ones on your part. But
Right. It's
um,
the ideological divide is always going to be the big truncation there at the end, I think, with principled
yeah.
opposition to the bourgeois. But no, I
Well,
really appreciate
as
the conversation. Thank you for coming on.
I was gonna, well, you're welcome. As Lernerbox once said, a wise man. Liberals were tragically born without imaginations. So my liberal sensibilities prevent me from advocating for such a structural change. But no, it was fun coming on. Like I said to the audience, if you're interested in economic discussions like these, you can subscribe to my channel econoboi on YouTube. And it was a good round two, Vosh. Let's hope we can find something for round three one of these days.
Yeah, we'll debate. What would be a good thing? Did you like the new Matrix movie?
Um, well, I thought it was better than most, but it wasn't. I mean, it was just okay. It wasn't a disaster or anything, but it wasn't. People were expecting a lot out of it.
I haven't seen it. I'll construct my opinions to be the opposite of yours, and we'll battle over that.
Well, I do have to warn you. Well, what, never mind. No preconceived notions. Just go in blind on it. It's on HBO Max. I thought it was okay. I'd give it a 5 out of 10. If I had to recommend an absolutely banger of a TV show, it is going to have to be Mr. In Between on Hulu. I'm sure you've got a Hulu account. Best TV show no one's talking about or gives a shit about. Really, really good show, though. Oh, goodness. I have one more thing. Do you play Civilization?
I played Civ 4 for a long time when I was younger. The only Civ game I ever liked.
Well, if you are interested, a content creator by the name of Taftage is trying to organize a civilization content creator showdown, of which I am a part. And she and I are pretty fucking good at civilization, Vosh.
Which
So
Civ is it?
don't want to. Civ 5, not 4, but same thing.
Gotcha. Civ 5 was god awful at release. But I hear they fixed it up a bunch afterwards, so. Um, well, I'll be sure to take a look. I look forward to the degenerate 1 unit per tile rule, encouraging good and interesting gameplay.
Hell yeah. All right, bud. Talk to you later. It was a good talk.
Have a wonderful day. Night, whatever.
You too.
Bye. Okay, sorry. I'm so tired, and I'm working off so little sleep. If I came off like weird or then I apologize. It wasn't my intention. I enjoyed the conversation a lot. Okay. Oh god. Okay, so for any of you who are wondering why the conversation that I just had went differently from a lot of conversations that I've had on this subject before, the issue is we always talk about the empirics. Well, can worker cooperatives perform at an equal level to traditional firms? Whatever. But I usually move away from talking about the moral prescription, the need to mandate them. And the reason for that is because it's an ideological thing and it can't be borne out in numbers as much. You have to you have to talk like the narrative of history, class conflict, whatever. And that's the real reason I care about this, you know? I wouldn't be so heavy on worker cooperatives if it was just like, oh well, it'll make the line go up faster, you know. Um yeah, so that's the basic idea for me. So for anyone who wants a summary of my positions on this, okay, they're fundamentally as follows, okay? Worker cooperatives, in my mind, the mandate for all worker cooperatives, okay, so everything above a given like minimal size is a worker cooperative. The idea for me is this, okay? First of all, I think it would be better to their workers. I think that bears out okay, you know. However marginally, I think it would work out. I think we can manage the financing as well if it was mandated, because you would just have non-controlling shares when you got rid of controlling shares as a concept, because controlling shares confers capital ownership upon a person. Okay, so that's simple enough. Ideologically, a lot of the issues we have is that the most powerful people in every capitalist country are usually people who have very different interests to the vast majority of the citizens of that country. Okay, this is the fundamental divide between the bourgeois and the working class. This divide is as evident today as it was 200 years ago, though it's been abstracted from view in a number of ways. Nowadays, people don't know their CEOs as well as they know their immediate managers. We're not in the day of the robber barons the way we used to, and the Pinkertons don't literally come and gun down union workers the way they used to as well. But the fundamental power relationship has stayed the same, because you know what's way more effective than hiring the Pinkertons? Going golfing with Murdoch and having Murdoch tell his writers, tell his broadcasters, that actually being in a union makes you gay, you know, that works better, you know. Direct conflict, bloodshed, direct violence, that is an ineffective and inefficient way of ensuring control of the working class. But manufactured consent, shared class interest between the bourgeois. These are very effective ways of managing your material interest for a number of reasons. If you can convince people to vote against their interest, then there's no issue, right? Hey, people want us to not deal with climate change, and they're voting to not deal with climate change. Everything's fine. Well, of course, no, it's not, you know. The reason people vote the way they do is because of the info they're supplied, and the info they're supplied is going to be biased by the institutions that not only produce that information, but present it. Basic manufacturing consent stuff, you know? And you look all over the world, and it seems like, and I understand this comes across like me, building a grand historical narrative, because I totally am, but I really feel like you can empirically bear this out. Basically, all problems in general are caused by people in power with different interests to the people who suffer the consequences of their behavior. If you take a look at almost every massacre, Holocaust, war, every like manufacturing failure, kids being poisoned by lead, like everything, right? It was slavery, like everything. It's people with different sets of interests, and the person with more power gets to do their set of interests. That's like everything. That's like everything everywhere, you know? And the thing is, you can't get rid of hierarchy through democracy, but you can weaken it, right? Because there's still a hierarchy in a democratic government, even if you had some super advanced anarchist one or whatever like crazy super like commune elected board whatever fucking term you want for it, you know, that person would still have more power than the average individual. But the difference is not as great as the difference between like Ho Chi Minh and an average North Korean citizen, right? You know what I mean? You get what I'm talking about, right? Like, democracy doesn't fix the problem of hierarchy, but it mitigates it substantially. And you mitigate it by making sure that the people on top. Did I say Vietnamese? I'm sorry, dude. The memes were so fucking good with Luna Oi. I'm so sorry. North Korea. Um, I don't think Ho Chi Minh had any power over the North Vietnamese. Just clarifying, okay? Um, like, the problem with hierarchy is still there. Did I do it again? Did I do it again? Guys, I slept for 2 hours. Listen, you said North Korea? Ho Chi Minh was in Korea. Wait, Ho Chi Minh was in Vietnam. No, the mix up was the other way. I meant to say fucking the other guy. Not Ho Chi Minh. No, the other guy. The bad guy. Kim Jong Un. Yeah, Jesus. I'm really tired. I've did 2 hours of sleep. Okay, I'm firing on all cylinders right now. Okay, and I'm racist. No, I'm not. Thank you. Listen, please listen. Please listen. Okay, please listen to me. Okay. You can't get rid of hierarchy through democracy, but democracy mitigates hierarchy, and the way you mitigate it is by trying to ensure that people with different levels of power have the same material interests. Okay. Now, if Kim Jong Un wants to like just kill a guy, okay, like what can the people of North Korea do? What can they do? Like nothing, right? There's like no relationship. What did I misspeak on? You know what? We're just gonna. Okay, forget the analogy. Forget the analogy. We're just gonna use abstractions, okay? If an authoritarian wants to do a thing, there's not much that the citizens beneath them can do about it. They have different material interests, okay? But hypothetically, in a democracy, you know, politicians have to be popular in order to be reelected or elected in the first place, right? So, in order for them to be popular, they have to do things that people who vote for them like. And that is a shared material interest. It is in the material interest, hypothetically, of a leader in a democratic country to do things that the regular people want, because that's how you get elected, right? Now, that's not a perfect system, but it's better than an authoritarian government. It's better than just a dictatorship, okay? And that's what I'm talking about with regards to the economy, okay? The fundamental issue here is one of hierarchy. The bourgeois right now are a distinct class with distinct class interests. Are you really explaining why democracy is good? Yes, because people often don't know. Democracy is good, not just because it's like a cool new modern idea or because it's like more fair or whatever, but because the drive to make systems better is to make sure people at the top and people at the bottom are pushing in the same direction, not opposite directions. Opposite directions causes suffering and tension. It prevents transparency and creates a lack of accountability. It destroys people and it destroys systems. Pushing in the same direction is a good thing, okay? And the issue is, with economic autocracy, there is literally no way for us to meaningfully check the interests of the bourgeois, the people in power, outside of voting with your wallet, which is a traditional liberal response. Oh, you don't like that Jeff Bezos is so powerful that his decision to build new plants can make or break entire like political deals? You don't like the fact that he's like the bedrock of like the fucking modern American economy? Just don't buy from the gajillion-dollar economy. You know, like, yeah, like bullshit like that. Clearly that doesn't work. Boycotts don't work unless they're very local and very, very targeted, you know. why the bourgeois want to destroy the world. The bourgeois don't want to destroy the world. That's the thing you have to understand. The bourgeois buy their own bullshit. Do you think that the monarchies of Europe thought that they were just like really cruel, like assholes? They didn't. Read Machiavellian literature, okay? Because that's what they read. The leaders back in like feudal Europe, for the most part, thought that they were A, ascribed by the divine right of kings, and B, they thought that the average peasant, through blood, was incapable of managing their own affairs, and that it was the job of a monarch to rule the affairs of the realm because nobody else could do it. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? You buy the ideology that legitimizes your reign, okay? So the monarchs don't just sit there in their throne thinking, haha, I'm evil, we could have a democracy, but I refuse to. There were people back during the 18th century that legitimately believed that democracy couldn't work because the serfs, the peasantry, were not capable of managing their own affairs. That wasn't just evil people who were super wealthy, like cackling and like rubbing their hands together or whatever. That was a common idea, and it was a commonly held idea by the peasantry as well. Oftentimes the peasantry legitimately felt like, sure, there are problems, but you need a king, you need a queen. People believed in the people above them often, because what alternative was there? That was the system they lived in. And systems self-perpetuate. The ideology of the system feeds into the system's legitimacy, and the system produces the ideology that will be used to justify it. The same thing happened with slavery, didn't it? Which came first, guys? Slavery or modern scientific racism? The answer is the former. The transatlantic slave trade came about, and people were like, oh, we sure are doing awful shit right now. I hope we can invent an ideological and pseudoscientific system that justifies this. And then, wow, they found one, if you can believe it. Simplifying a bit, but yeah. Post hoc justification, big problem, okay? And right now here in America, we have the same basic issue with perceived meritocracy. It's okay that the ultra wealthy have all this power because you can do it too. If you're very good and smart, you can be the next Jeff Bezos. When of course you can't, but if you don't become the next Jeff Bezos, they get to say, well, it's just because you weren't good enough. We live in a meritocracy, so anyone with power must necessarily deserve that power. The ideology justifies the system, and the system produces the ideology. And the bourgeois, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, are exactly the same, okay? Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos don't think they're evil. They think they're better than you. That's it. It's that simple. They think they're smarter, more driven, more capable, more willing to make the difficult choices. They think that their lot in life is, oh, sure, maybe it's partly due to luck and circumstances. They don't believe in they don't necessarily believe in the divine right to rule. Maybe some of them do, but, they'll acknowledge some, fortune. They'll go on their book tours and interviews and they'll acknowledge this. But deep down, internally, fundamentally, they believe very deeply in two basic things, okay? Meritocracy and individualism. Meritocracy is what brought them there, and individualism is the reason why they can't understand the relationship between their personal power and the broader institutional systems that not only brought them to where they are now, but that they have the ability to change directly. I genuinely think that your average ultra-wealthy billionaire, who is very class-conscious in the sense that they will promote the interests of the bourgeois and they will fight for the interests of the bourgeois and so on, I genuinely think that even though they act in their class interest, they are as aware of their class interest as the average worker is. That the average bourgeois, Yale graduate student, whatever, probably is acting out of the same intuitive, reflective expression of their ideology that a worker is. That people are unconscious, but circumstances, by which I mean disproportionate power, align the unconscious class advocacy of the bourgeois with their own interests. Whereas, because the workers are not in power, their unconscious class interest is not aligned with their material interest. Does that make sense? Please, God, I feel like that was a good point. Why is Vosh saying ideology in a strange way? Because it's something Slavoj Žižek is known for saying, and he has a funny Slovakian accent, okay? Does what I say make sense? I know I'm very tired, but I feel like this is very important, okay? Okay, hopefully everyone gets that. So that's the reason why fundamentally this is an ideological divide. And that's why this debate went the way that it did. Because normally I talk about the empirics. Here's a study saying worker co-ops are good for people. Here's a study saying they make money, blah, 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 blah. But that's not why I like worker co-ops. I like worker co-ops for the same reason that I would have liked the abolition of the monarchy. I like worker co-ops for the same reason that I would have supported, you know, any system um, that would ameliorate these distinctions. That was a good explanation. I should take a few minutes to talk to Soaked and Left to be very chill. No, I'm sorry. I'm exhausted. I can't even read donos. Soaked and Left, you literally can come on the stream like anytime. You realize that, right? We have a good relationship. You're one of like 5 people I get along with. It doesn't have to be a circumstantial thing. You can just DM and I'll be like, oh yeah, sure, come on. Okay. I have 2 channels now. There's always room for content. Okay. I love you guys very, very much. You're beautiful people, and I love you. Okay? I promise I'll read the donos next stream, okay? I had no idea you talked to Michaela Peterson. Yeah, it's because you're lame. Because you're a loser. Go check out my interview with Michaela Peterson on Michaela Peterson's channel. I talked to Jordan Peterson's daughter. I didn't make any creepy comments. I'm sorry. That's very disappointing to you guys. Okay, I'm sorry about the donos not being read. I love you. Goodbye.